and Cowboy gave up his only horse. What 70 Apache warriors did next will shock you. He found her at the lip of a dry wash, where the earth had cracked into scales and the moonlight made every thorn look like a needle. She lay half-slid down the bank, one leg trapped at a sick angle under the weight of her own body and a tumble of gravel, her breath a shallow stitch in the quiet. Jesse Hale did not call out first. He watched the rise of her ribs, counted to 12, and only then slid down the embankment on his hip, palms out, letting the loose dirt announce him instead of his voice. Her eyes flashed open, black water catching starlight, and then closed again as fever worked its slow, stupid knot through her mind. He had seen a break like that before, on a Mustang that had gone into a gopher hole at a dead run. It wasn't only the shin. The twist higher up told him the fibers were torn like wet canvas, and the heat on her forehead told him time had already started taking what it always takes. He set his hat on the ground where she could see it, a small ritual of de-arming, and he spoke in a quiet, plain talk meant as much for himself as for her. "You're hurt. I'm here to lift. I won't harm you." He didn't know what she understood, but her fingers twitched in a way that was neither fight nor surrender, just the simple human answer to simple human tone. The horse, his only horse, a short-backed dun with a stubborn heart and a salt-white star on his forehead, stood above them, blowing once, testing the scent. Jesse loosened the coil from his saddle and cut it in half with his knife, then split the yucca stalks he had passed 3 bends back. He wrapped the stalks in his shirt and bound them to her leg with his cut rope, apologizing under his breath for each pull, counting again because numbers gave the hands something to hold when the heart wanted to shake. When she stiffened with pain, he steadied the back of her head, letting her bite on the folded leather he laid between her teeth. The sweat that broke on her skin smelled of iron and sage. He made a sling from the blanket roll, slipped it under her shoulders, and braced the rest of her weight in the crook of his arm. The dun set its feet wide, while Jesse eased her up and tied the free half of the rope to the stirrup, looping the other end around his waist. He did not put a foot in the stirrup. He would not ride while she hung there like freight. Instead, he walked, hip against saddle, letting the rope bite into his belt and the woman's weight lean into the animal in small swings. The first 100 yards were all awkwardness and breath. The second 100 drew sweat from his scalp, and after that he did not count yards anymore. He marked the night by the changes of sound. The wash quieted, the crickets traded places with the wind, and the far-off river spoke in a voice like a person humming alone. The ground smoothed by degrees. Somewhere in that smoothing she went limp, and the rope slackened. He thought she had slipped from consciousness again, but when he looked up, her eyes were open and very clear, focused on some point behind him, beyond him, out where the road and the sky were busy with each other. He nodded as if to say, "Yes, that's where we're headed." She closed her eyes again, and he felt the little weight of trust settle into the rope like a second knot. When the terrain leveled fully and the town's dim yellow smear showed on the horizon, he stopped. The dun blew softly, then shook its head, impatient to be out of the harness of worry. Jesse untied the rope from his waist and from the stirrup, pulled the knot free and stuffed the coil in his pocket out of habit, as if such a small thing might be needed later. He tightened the splint, ran his hand once down the horse's shoulder and put his mouth to the animal's ear. "Easy! You know the way." He turned the dun toward the lights and slapped the rump just once. The horse started at a walk, then a trot, finding his own line toward the faint lamps and the shape of a street. Jesse watched them move away, the woman swaying in the sling, the horse figuring its balance beneath her. A picture no one would believe in a bar's corner talk, a thing you had to watch with your own eyes to take as true. The rope burns on his waist began to sing when he started walking. There would be more miles on foot than any doctor would advise. He was not one of those men whose lives fit neatly into the town's long shadow. His life had been a long series of edges, and a handful of times he had watched another breath fail because he could not make himself step the extra yard. Tonight, with the cold like sand in the lungs, he had no appetite for that old cowardice. Boots split, lips cracked. He followed the faint star of the town's lamps and let his mind empty down to the problem of putting one foot where the other had been. He tried not to think of water. He tried not to think of the black mouth of the canyon that had taken his brother when he was 15 and too sure of his own hands. He tried not to think about the color of blood on snow and the way certain men whispered certain names, names like hers, like they were spitting out a seed. The night made thinking both easy and dangerous. So he thought instead of his mother's rule about kindness, which had not been a rule so much as a way of cooking. You seasoned everything with it, even the hard meat, especially the hard meat, because it made the chewing possible. By the time the first false dawn touched the far ridge, his shoulders were one whole ache, and each toe had its own idea about forgiveness. The town was either closer or farther depending on which breath he counted as the counting breath. A stray dog joined him for a quarter mile, then decided he had nothing worth guarding and peeled away. He laughed once, the sound small and out of place in the plain. When he finally reached the scattered outskirts, the wreck of a plow, a heap of broken crates, the shimmer of a bottle along a fence, he did not look at the houses. He looked only for the angular silhouette of the doctor's place, which put up a chimney plume, even in summer, because the old man loved his stove like other men loved their pianos. The doctor's office sat hunkered behind a Cotonista hedge, shutters latched tight. Jesse mounted the 3 steps, leaned his forehead against the cold of the door, and knocked in a rhythm that would wake a man without riling him. Pause 2, pause 1. It was not the doctor who answered. It was his wife, hair in a plait, night robe cinched with a braided cord, eyes the color of very strong tea. She looked at Jesse as if her mind were a ledger rapidly balancing columns, dust, blood, rope. The look of a man who had eaten nothing but distance for hours. He spoke first. I sent a woman ahead on my horse. Broken leg, fever. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat making the words scratch. I need your stove and your hands. Mrs. Carter, Evelyn, to anyone who had ever eaten her pie, opened the door wider without a single further question. Inside, the air held that complicated perfume of healing, alcohol and herbs and starch and the ghost of wood smoke. The horse had done exactly what Jesse knew it would do, stopped at the little hitch rail and snorted until the woman inside took notice. The sling had sagged and the woman had half slid, but the doctor, Nathaniel Carter, gruff enough to frighten children into obedience, gentle enough to be trusted by the dying, had reached her in time. He and his wife had cut the sling free and carried her between them like she was a small winter tree that had to be replanted carefully. The woman's skin was hot under the lamp. The brake had to be set again, the splint redone, something stronger brewed to fight the heat inside her. Jesse stood there and felt his edges go soft, his mind refusing to take another sharpness after so many. Evelyn guided him by the elbow to the stove. Sit, boots off. He tried to protest, and she issued a tiny noise that was not a scold, but sat next door to one. He sat. He peeled his boots, as if peeling his own hide. The doctor's hands worked in that brisk, economical dance they did, when time could be borrowed, if not repaid. Jesse helped when asked, holding a lamp, tearing sheets into strips, pinning the woman's shoulders down when the bone set made her arch up with a sound that hauled at his stomach like a hook. She spoke once, a river of words in a language Jesse did not carry, and her eyes floated toward the ceiling. He wanted to say something back in the same current, but all he had was yes. Easy now, yes, yes, yes. As if his voice could fill the spaces pain had punched in the air. The doctor bound the leg tight, checked her pulse with 2 fingers, poured a thin stream of willowbark tea between her lips. The clock on the mantel ticked in a way that would have been comforting if it had not also sounded like each second falling out of reach. There was a cot along the far wall. When the worst of the work was finished and the woman slept in that peculiar hard sleep that may be a bridge or a cliff, Evelyn patted the cot and told Jesse to lie down. He did not argue. He could not. He curled with his back to the stove, cheek on his folded arm, and hairline burning with the memory of the wind. In the last sliver of consciousness, he felt something like shame. No, not quite shame, something kin to it, but cleaner. He had done a simple right thing, and it had made him so tired that no room remained in him for anything else. The stove ticked. The smell of the room shifted toward ease. He slept without dreams, or he dreamed of a river that had no banks. Morning does not ask permission to enter. It threw itself through the shutters like a boy leaping a fence, clattered off the lamp rims, landed on the woman's face, and made the fever sheen glow like oil. Jesse woke to voices and to the weight of eyes that were not friendly. He sat up and found the door ajar and the slice of the street beyond it populated by hat brims and rifle barrels and faces holding the hard shapes that fear can arrange them into. A boy, sunrise red with importance, pointed into the room and said the word enemy with the nervous quickness of someone trying it on for the first time and liking how it fit his mouth. Evelyn moved past Jesse like a crow herding a cat. Unafraid, efficient, making noise in exactly the right tone to dissuade nonsense. Dr. Carter, hair standing in 3 different directions, appeared at her shoulder and propped his hands on his hips. He told the boy he would wash his mouth out with lie if he brought that word into his house again, and he told the men on the stoop that the fence rail would suit their rifles better than his doorway. The men retreated a half step. People are soft clay at first light. A push one way makes a wall, a push the other makes a cup. Jesse put his boots back on with a wince, stood, and felt the new day weigh itself out in his bones. He stepped into the door's frame and asked the only question worth breath. "Did my horse make it back sound?" A man nodded and flicked his chin toward the hitch rail. The dun stood there, sweat dried into a chalk, head low, one ear canted toward the room as if listening for a name that had yet to be said. Jesse wanted to bury his face in the animal's neck, but the street made a new sound then, a higher one, the thin whistle of rumor turning corners. It ran from the door of the general store to the blacksmith's, rattled the cafe window panes, and reached the boarding house in time to be poured into a coffee cup like the day's first sugar. He could feel the town change around him the way a man can feel an old wound change when weather shifts. Doors that had not opened for him before cracked so neighbors could peer. The sheriff passed in the street, jaw clenched around a piece of chaw, eyes making a road from Jesse's face to the cot and back again. Sheriff Tom Avery was a man built for storms, all rope and angle, yet there was a position in his shoulders that suggested he would rather lift a sack of flour than a gun, any day. He tipped his hat to the doctor, to Evelyn, and finally to Jesse. "We'll talk," he said. Not a threat, not a promise, a measurement. What Jesse felt then could not be sorted the way he usually sorted things. There was pride in the horse for doing what he had been asked. There was relief in the woman's new breathing, lighter now, like a sparrow on a branch instead of a stone in water. There was the old knowledge that a town's first question is never what happened, but who is responsible, and that his face, too often, was willing to take the weight of that. He swallowed and tasted iron again. He nodded at the sheriff and let the man go. Evelyn pressed a cup of watered coffee into Jesse's hand and kept her eye on the door like a keeper watches her gate at lambing time. The woman in the cot stirred and muttered. Her fingers moved across her own breastbone as if counting something there. He could not know what she measured, whether it was pain or breath or the names of people who had loved her once. He only knew that if he had met her a day later by the wash instead of last night, she would have been another kind of story, the kind men told too fast, with laughter riding the tail to shove away the piece of horror caught in the throat. Outside, the town busied itself with the business towns do when they are unsure whether to be brave or small. Men bartered for cartridges. A woman yanked her child by the sleeve so hard the little girl left the ground for a step. 2 riders who did not belong here, hired men from the big outfit north, lounged by the trough and traded remarks that were too loud and did not care who heard. The word Indians was repeated with the stealthy excitement people feel when they believe they are near a performance staged for them by history. Jesse had known that look in a child's eyes at a traveling show, and he had seen it darken into something uglier when the show turned out to be a real thing that bled. He finished the coffee because refusing a gift from that woman would have been a sin in his mother's church, should his mother have had a church. He set the cup down, and the dun lifted its head, ears going to a point. Jesse didn't hear it yet. The horse heard it first, because a horse is a stringed instrument pulled tight between earth and sky. The dun's skin quivered along its ribcage, the way water shivers before wind. A second later, Jesse felt it through the soles of his boots, a tremble so faint he might have blamed it on hunger if he were a man inclined to lie to himself. He stepped out into the street to see over the hedge. The horizon looked the same as it had every morning of his life, long, frank, unalarmed. Then the tone of the light shifted a fraction, as if the sun had exhaled. A grey-brown curtain began to rise where the land dipped, thin at first, like breaths on cold glass. People talk about clouds gathering in the west, as if it is always a storm you can smell coming. This was not a storm. This was the earth's own breath turned visible by hooves. It climbed slow as a pulled shade, until the whole edge of the world wore a fringed hem. Behind him, the talk in the street thinned and sharpened. He did not turn to look at them. He kept his eyes on that far line while the dust rose into one long, dark ribbon that meant riders. Morning arrived like a held breath finally let go, and the town received it with shutters nailed and rifles wedded to their owners' shoulders. Curtains trembled in tiny, guilty motions. Above the doctor's hedge, the street looked narrower, as if fear had leaned both sides of it inward. Bells did not ring. The cafe did not clatter its cups. The blacksmith left his anvil cold. No one wanted to offer the day any sound that might be mistaken for invitation. The dust on the horizon had hung through the first pale wash of dawn, and then settled in the low places like smoke that had lost the memory of fire. Somewhere out there were hooves. Somewhere out there, eyes counted doors. Inside the doctor's front room, the lamp had been turned down to a thin thought of flame. The woman slept, her face slack with a kind of peace that was not comfortable, but was at least indifferent to pain. The tight binding on her leg looked cleaner under the day's light. The bone, obliged back into alignment, would need time. Most towns do not allow strangers. Jesse sat on a chair that complained under his weight and watched the door, as if the door itself were a sick thing that might need holding down when the fever took it. He had slept in snatches between sounds, which meant he had not slept at all. He was a man who had never kept much beyond a horse, a coat, a length of rope, and that plain stubbornness men either admire or shoot. This morning, he had exactly the same inventory, minus the illusions. Sheriff Tom Avery appeared with the odor of the outside on him, cold iron and sage bruised under boots. He took in the room with a slow sweep. The cot, the woman, the stove, Evelyn poised with her kettle, Jesse's hands laced together as if he could handcuff himself to patience and make it hold. Avery set his hat on a corner of the desk and placed himself where he could speak without raising his voice. He was decent in the way of men who had lived long, with the self-knowledge that they are not clever enough to win by tricks, so they must win by plainness. "I need the truth," he said. Simple and in order. Jesse told it as he had lived it. The wash, the break, the rope cut in half, the long walk, the horse sent on. He gave no embellishment, offered no poetry to make himself look better than he was. The sheriff watched him with the focus of a carpenter measuring a beam. If the beam carried, he would use it, and if it split, he would throw it away. When Jesse finished, the room held its breath again, and the clock on the mantel ticked like a nail being driven at a reasonable pace. "Name?" Avery asked, eyes shifting to the cot. Jesse shook his head. "She spoke, Sheriff. I didn't carry it. My ear's not made for the learning you'd want. She say where from?" Another shake, only that her leg had sworn itself against her body and led the rebellion. Avery's mouth did a small thing that might have been relief or sorrow or the tight tide between the two. He nodded once to the doctor and another time to Evelyn, as if he could add their steadiness to his own just by counting it. town's wound up," he said, "spooked by the dust and the boys' talk before breakfast. I'm going to tell them to stay inside, to hold their fire unless I say otherwise, to keep the talk soft. They might listen to me while they remember I've saved their sons from hanging for horseplay 3 different times. They might not, once the first loud man finds his platform." As if summoned by the outline of that sentence, the first loud man presented himself. Silas McCrae filled the doorway without actually being a big man. He had that trick actors learn, the way to occupy the shape of a room without changing any of its dimensions. His coat had a city's cut, stiff at the lapels. His hat was dark and narrow of brim, more banker than rider. He made wealth look like a religion and himself its tithing plate. Behind him lounged 2 of his men, their faces arranged in the obscene ease of people paid to make fear honest. "Sheriff," McCrae said, and his tone made the title sound like a nickname. "Doctor, Mrs. Carter." He let his gaze touch the cot last, then recoiled as if his eyes had found a stain stubborn to soap. "And the man who brought our trouble home by the hand." Avery didn't move toward his hat. "Morning, Silas." "Not much of a morning when the horizon's crawling," McCrae said. "Word from the ridge says the hills are walking down on us. I imagine you'll want all decent men in town to take their positions, which means deputizing anyone with a steady aim." "I'll choose my own steadies," Avery said, "and my own aim." McCrae put his palm to the lintel as if measuring how much of the house belonged to him, and when it turned out none did, he adjusted his smile. "You'll also want to make a statement. Statements control crowds, Tom. A town is just a moving crowd with a ledger and a preacher. There is no statement clearer than consequence. You'll get ahead of panic if you turn the woman over now. She's their business. We make it plain we don't interfere in it. They take her, they go. We keep what's ours, they keep what's theirs, and the line between remains a line." Evelyn's kettle chose that moment to spit a single angry note, and she took it off the stove with the quiet of someone saving a child from a hot handle. "That woman is my patient," the doctor said, voice like a rasp that had cleaned its teeth. "She stays." McCrae's eyes slid to Jesse. They did not read him. They evaluated him like a piece of land with a poor well, but excellent grass. "This is the man who set it in motion. He will provide the spine for your statement. Send him out with the woman on the horse, and the rest of us will watch from safe distance. It will do." Jesse felt that old weight settle across his shoulders, the assortment of other men's mistakes he had found himself carrying since he was sapling thin. He did not flinch under it. There are hours when a man is so tired he becomes the simplest version of himself. He stood, and the chair creaked to protest, and he said, "She doesn't go anywhere that requires pain to move her, and no one hauls her like a sack to unspook men who know better than to spook." McCrae's smile didn't change. It didn't have to. His smile was a barn door tied open with a rope. The weather went through it one way or the other. "Listen to reason, friend. Reason says 70 riders don't come to collect a thank you note. Reason says a town with a creek and a mill and fence posts cut should not offer its throat to a knife to prove its nobility. Reason also says if you want to keep a town alive, you don't hand over the sick like kindling," Jesse replied. He hadn't planned to be sharp, but the day had sharpened him, and the blade cut without apology. "Stand your men at windows if you must. Oil your guns if it calms your hand. But she stays where she can live. There are men who take contradiction as nourishment. They grow with it, become greener." McCrae's eyes brightened the way lizards brighten when they find a rock that holds the day's heat. "You understand nothing," he said pleasantly. "Water keeps this town. Creek runs thin in a dry year, thinner when cattle from the north stray the bank to mud. I have men, Sheriff, good men with good tools. Fences keep the herds out, keep the banks green, keep the mills spinning, keep babies fed. It's simple economy, but fences and agreements require calm. Panic will trample what patience might build." He lifted 2 fingers toward the cot with a gentleness that was its own cruelty. "That panic rides with these people. They bring it like weather. If you are too squeamish to deliver her, then you must at least remove her. Set her outside of town, where her own can take her without our doors being the stage." Avery stepped between McCrae's hand and the cot without touching either, which is a skill not easily learned. She remains under the doctor's care until he releases her. That is the law of this house and of my town. McCrae's smile tightened one screw's turn. This isn't your town anymore, Tom. It's a set of accounts. Mine stretches across more of them than yours. He angled his head, and one of his men, Wade Cutter, a foreman who chewed nails for the flavor, shifted his weight just enough to let the iron at his hip whisper. Jesse watched the whisper travel through the sheriff's back. It didn't make him smaller, it settled him. "Silas," Avery said, "you take one step toward making this place your counting room, and I'll put you in a cell for breathing too loudly. Go tell your men to put their barrels down and their mouths on quiet. I'll do the talking." "Do it quick," McCrae said. He straightened the lapels that did not need straightening. "Because the boy from the ridge is on my porch, and I heard every word before I came here. Says they hold formation. Says they waited through the dark like they were counting the stars they'd ride under. Says they number more than 30, more than 40. He tilted his head so the light caught his teeth. "He says more than 60. I like my information wide. I'll call it 70. It makes a better story, don't you think? A town will behave if you give it a number large enough to fear." The kettle might have leapt again if Evelyn had not poured its temper into a cup. She handed the cup to Jesse because she understood something about where courage lives. It needs a warm place to be kept like bread dough. Jesse took a sip and felt not bravery, but steadiness slide down his throat. He could hold a street if asked. He could hold himself. He could not hold the town. The town would decide what sort of thing it was, a wall or a bowl, on its own terms. Avery nodded once toward McCrae and once toward the window, and he took his hat and went to the stoop where the town had gathered in pieces. He did not raise his arms. He did not call for quiet with bombast. He spoke as if each man already knew what he meant and only needed to be reminded of it. "Hold to your houses. Put your rifles down from the glass. No one fires unless I say. No one fires at shadows. No one fires at fear. If a shot goes off that ain't mine, I'll come take your weapon myself and sell it back to you after planting season." There was laughter. Laughter is a rope thrown to a drowning animal. If it catches, the rest is possible. The faces in the windows softened into the faces of people who had seen this man tramp through their kitchens with muddy boots to find their children under beds. Avery turned to the riders posted at the ends of the street and spoke low. Jesse could not hear the words. He knew what they were from the shape of Avery's shoulders. Calm, don't escalate, watch your mouths, keep your finger joints soft. In the space he left, McCrae stepped forward to make his own speech. Parallel, poisonous. He didn't need volume. He planted his men at the corners with the precision of a surveyor and spoke between them like a fence line. If they come, and they will, remember, there's no law east of the hill except the one we write today. We write it clean and hard. We write it in a language horses understand. He let his eyes rest again on the doctor's door. A sign shows strength. A sign shown early avoids unnecessary cash and blood. Put the woman outside the hedge with a blanket and a canteen. Let the sheriff keep his conscience. Let the rest of us keep our property. Evelyn clicked her tongue against her teeth. It was such a small sound. Jesse watched 3 men flinch as if she had snapped a whip. Mrs. Carter took the woman's hand and smoothed the hair back from her brow. In a voice pitched for no one beyond the cot, she said, "You are safe." The woman's lips moved again, slow, like someone offering a word as a gift wrapped too tight. Evelyn shook her head slightly, equal parts apology and promise. "We don't share a tongue," she said to Jesse, but her eyes are clear. She knows help when it hurts the way healing hurts. Nathaniel Carter drew a fresh breath and found the shape of authority that has nothing to do with the sheriff's badge and everything to do with the line men hold because they were taught to hold it. "Sheriff," he said through the open door, "you tell them I will not release a patient into the street to satisfy the whims of a rancher." McCrae laughed, truly laughed, delighted by the austerity of someone else's principles. "Doctor, you are a brick. I admire bricks. They make fine chimneys for men with better vision." There was a commotion then at the far end of the street. The kind of commotion that results from someone who has run with a message and has not decided whether the message will make him a hero or a fool. A ranch hand Jesse recognized from the north pastures, Boyd, with the gait of one leg longer than the other and the pride of a new mustache, came skidding to a stop in a fringe of dust. He gulped air like a fish and pointed without words. The horizon did not need his finger to make itself seen. "Don't crowd," Avery said to the men who boiled up toward him as curiosity tried to cross the line into dread. "Last I checked, we don't make good decisions with our chins out." 70, Boyd managed, finding the number in his mouth like a coin too big to spit or swallow. "Could be more. They sit their horses like posts. Just looking, not in a hurry." "Not in a hurry," McCrae repeated, savoring the phrase, "which means they came to stay." He clapped his hands softly, as if calling in a bird dog. "Tom, it is time. One small gesture, a blanket and a canteen. The rest of us watch the desert correct itself." Jesse stepped into the doorway fully then, because neutrality becomes complicity, at a point a man can feel in his joints. He did not reach for his gun. He did not need the shape of it to lend him authority. "She doesn't leave," he said. "If this town needs a sign, use me. I'll stand in the street where they can see I'm the fool who gave up his horse. If they want to take something, let them take a look. If they want to speak, I'll listen. But that woman stays under care." The room held that statement for a moment, turned it in the light to see where the flaw lay. The flaw was obvious. One man cannot be the capital of a town's fear, but courage is a contagious thing. The doctor nodded, as if Jesse had fetched a scalpel without being asked. Evelyn's chin rose a near-invisible notch. The sheriff's mouth loosened from a line to something like a tired smile. Even Boyd's second leg forgot it was shorter for a heartbeat. McCrae's patience, being a rented outfit, wore through where it rubbed. "You intend to negotiate for us?" he said. "You who woke up yesterday a nobody, intend to represent a town with a ledger thicker than your conscience." Jesse worked his jaw once, feeling the crackle where sleep had left grit in the hinge. "I intend to do what I can with what I have, which is not much. You do what you like with what you have, which is apparently everything but a suture's worth of decency." The word decency, when it strikes a certain kind of man, does not wound, it annoys. McCrae stepped down backward off the doctor's porch and dusted his hands as if washing an invisible flour from them. "I'll be at the church," he said. "Men who wish to use their time wisely will join me. We'll make sure there's a committee to receive our guests. Words will be printed, boundaries will be marked. If the sheriff is inclined to poetry, he can recite it to the women and make them feel safe while men build the fence that will be their safety." He left a quiet behind him that did not belong to him. Avery used it. He put a palm to Jesse's shoulder just for the weight of it, and then he went to make his rounds, door to door, voice to voice, reminding men who they were before the number 70 tried to rename them. Jesse felt Evelyn's hand replace the sheriff's. "Eat," she said, pressing a heel of bread into his palm. "Bread is a weapon that doesn't make more enemies." He took a bite that stuck halfway down and then decided he could swallow. The woman on the cot stirred and said a word that might have been a name. It sounded like a river in a mouth, like syllables polished by water. Jesse tried it once silently, just to feel how it shaped the throat. He failed it. He placed the failed try inside himself like a pebble he would smooth with handling until he could say it without breaking it. He did not know yet whether the word belonged to her or to the place she had come from. What he knew was that something in him had begun to rearrange itself around the idea that a life had been put under his guard, and that no one, not a sheriff's caution, not a rancher's ledger, would unassign him from that post. Outside, the town reorganized into the shapes fear prefers, triangles of whispered counsel, pairs at corners pretending to watch their own boots. A row of barrels lowered slowly from windows by wives who had decided their husbands' tempers would shoot by themselves if metal stayed too close to hand. The church took in men and sent them out with words that behaved like orders and had the crispness of doctrine without its mercy. McCrae's men spread along the edges as if they had grown there overnight from seeds left by the last dust devil. The mill wheel turned once, remembered its purpose, and then stopped because no one had given it permission to be louder than the town wanted to be. The doctor worked. Work is a faith that doesn't need a preacher. He washed the woman's face with a rag soaked in cool water, lifted her hand and set it back down with care, measured her breath against the ticking of the clock. He muttered to himself about pulse and heat, not because he required the words to know what to do, but because a room that holds a hurt thing cannot hold silence for long without going sour. Jesse held the cup, refilled the kettle, held the lamp when the flame needed trimming even though morning made it unnecessary. He discovered this version of himself did not need to be urged. He was employed by the fact of her suffering and paid in the coins of each easier breath. When the right kind of stillness fell, a stillness that suggested the desert had made up its mind, Boyd's voice floated in from the street again, this time level and spare. "They're there," he said, and this time he did not point. He didn't have to. The town had already turned as one head to look. Jesse stepped out through the hedge and stood next to the sheriff, who did not surprise him by being exactly where he should be. Avery's jaw worked a piece of chew that had long lost its flavor. His eyes were not hungry, they were careful. On the flats beyond the last fence line, the riders had drawn themselves into an arc that held the town the way a question holds an answer it is not fully sure it wants. They sat very still. Even the horses seemed to have chosen stillness as a strategy. The dust at their heels lifted and fell in sheets like the ghost of surf. They were not close enough for Jesse to count faces, but he could count the measure of them. Not a rabble, not a mob. A formation, a decision made visible. The curve they made suggested a circle with the town as its missing piece. 70, Boyd said softly. Not triumphantly, not fearfully, simply as a number that had earned the right to be named. Jesse believed him. The number had its own gravity. It rearranged the street without moving it. Nothing rushed. No firearm cracked the morning into splinters. The sheriff's hand hovered an inch above his sidearm and then fell to his thigh. McCrae was somewhere behind Jesse, saying things that would keep him rich regardless of outcome. The doctor inside set his hand to a woman's brow to hold her on this side of whatever line she rode. Jesse took one step forward and then another, and felt the street recognize the shape of a vow. If it required a spine, he could furnish that. If it required blame, he could carry it. If it required him to stand alone so that others might rediscover how not to be small, he could do that too. Ahead of him, the riders held their crescent without fidget or impatience, an answer postponed but not withheld, precise and unhurried, their number larger than any gathering the town had ever seen. They halted at the distance an arrow would choose, as if the air itself had whispered the measurement into the lead horse's ear. The crescent they made did not wobble. It held shape like a thing hammered and cooled. Horses breathed steam into the warming morning, leather sighed, a raven crossed above and decided the ground silence was heavier than anything it could carry and veered away. The town breathed in uneven stitches. In windows, muzzles gleamed like blunt, suspicious eyes. On the doctor's stoop, Jesse felt the quiet reach into his chest and find the knot that kept him upright. It tightened once, not unkindly, to test whether it would hold. 3 riders eased forward from the arc. A war leader who sat his horse as though he had always sat this horse, and 2 men older than the day's light, their braids the color of sage stems left to winter. A 4th figure paced just ahead and just to the side, as a sheepdog walks not in front of the flock, but in the angle where responsibility lives. This was the scout, young, not a child anymore, not yet weighted down by age's accounting, face keen with the sort of intelligence that is always listening. He made the distance between languages look like ground a person might walk. Sheriff Avery stood beside Jesse without touching him, and that not touch was a kind of holding. His jaw ground slowly, thoughtfully, as if he could make words kinder by chewing them first. The doctor moved within the house, that beloved rasp of his voice offering the woman in his care the simple liturgy of medicine. Breathe, drink, sleep if you can. Evelyn folded linens with the precision of someone sharpening a blade. At the church, Silas McRae, arranged men like chess, is played by a person who believes the pieces should want what he wants. He sent Wade Cutter to stand near the blacksmiths, where hot-headedness could borrow a hammer's confidence, and he placed himself where his mouth would best reach both windows and the lull between breaths. McRae smiled into the crescent as if it had come to admire his money. The war leader halted at bowshot from the sheriff and the man who had left his gun belt in a room where a woman tried very hard to remain. He did not lift his hand in greeting. Instead, he waited, and in that waiting, there was an education. Jesse felt something in him straighten under the weight of being considered by eyes that did not confuse him with a category. The horse under the leader, black as cooled iron, mane braided into a thick rope bound with a strip of red, stamped once and then settled like a thought resolved. The scout glanced to the elders, to the leader, then forward. When he spoke, the first shape of the words was Spanish, soft edges, a street's talk polished by market stalls. And then he reached for English, the way a hand reaches for a rung, not made for it. He found it anyway. "They ask," he said, voice steady, the courage of translation squaring his shoulders, "for the one who gave the caballo, the horse, to the hurt woman, and the hands that mended her." The town had expected a demand that fit the legend it fed itself by lamplight. Tribute, blood, the sorting of guilt into piles labeled with old words. It needed that to justify what it had already decided about fear. The request surprised the town the way mercy always surprises those who have practiced for violence. You could feel the surprise pass through the street like a sudden shade on a hot noon. Some men lowered their rifles from the windows an inch. The sheriff's jaw stopped grinding for the length of a breath. Even McRae's smile consulted itself. Jesse's hand found the buckle that should have held his gun, as if remembering the old apartment of habit. He did not need it. He stepped down from the stoop and into the street, the loudness of his boot soles exaggerated by the day's intent. He felt his chest, his back, the belt's chafe where the rope had burned, the rawness at his lip where thirst had gnawed. He felt too the eyes of a woman on a cot who had breathed through a night because he had chosen to be stubborn in exactly the right way. He moved forward without hurry. There is a kind of speed that makes cowards of men who might otherwise be brave. He refused it. Avery did not stop him. He moved with him half a pace and then let the space open. It felt to Jesse like a father walking a boy to a threshold he must cross himself, and then trusting the boy to remember what doors are for. When Jesse had reached the measure of the war leader's gaze, he took off his hat and held it low. He did not bow. Bowing would have been theater in a place that despised it and honored something else. The scout watched his hands with particular interest, storing that movement away because the way men ask respect from each other is a language of its own. The war leader dismounted in a motion so precise it looked unconsidered. He stood on ground made shin-deep by a season of hooves and turned to his elders. One of them spoke softly, the other answered with a sound like wind through a boulder field. Approval, amused and proud. The leader's face carried a map of more miles than Jesse had walked in the last decade. A scar like a drawn thread near the lip, a way of holding still that civilized men forget when they get furniture. He took the reins of the horse that stood just behind him, a stallion the color of worked chestnut, mane braided with a careful hand, tail combed to silk. The animal's neck was shaped like a promise kept. The leader spoke. His words fell without hurry and stacked themselves cleanly. The scout listened with his whole body, head, chest, even the set of his knees, and then turned to Jesse, choosing English that would not bruise the meaning. "He says," the scout began, "a gift that holds life on this side of the fire must be answered with a gift that holds the road under your feet." He tapped his chest with his fist in that thoughtful way people do when they are sure of what they translate, as if anchoring the words to himself so they did not blow away. "He says the horse you gave carried your choosing. He brings you a horse that will carry the choosing you have not yet seen." The leader extended the reins. Not with a flourish. Ceremony is a kind of function, not a decoration, but with the exactness that makes a thing formal without making it rigid. Jesse did not reach at once. He looked to the doctor's hedge, to the window where Evelyn's face hovered behind a veil of muslin, to the cot where the woman's hand had shifted, as if somewhere inside a fever she recognized the sound of her own people's voice in the street. She did more than that. She woke into herself the way someone awakens at the edge of a memory that has been patiently waiting its turn. Her eyes cleared like glass, held to running water. She spoke 2 syllables that made the room wider, and Evelyn understood without knowing the dictionary that this was not a word for pain or for fear, but a name that braided blood and gratitude and kin. Evelyn opened the window on its latch because some sounds deserve air. The woman lifted her palm and laid it to her own heart, and when she found Jesse's figure across light and distance, her eyes found the rest of her speech. She held his without a rope, and in the holding there was the simplest body truth there is. This one, yes. The elders nodded at the woman's gesture as if it completed a circle drawn in the night. The leader's face softened the degree a wintered man permits when a season turns. The scout's smile belonged to a younger person who believed words could do most of the work and had not yet been corrected by cruelty too many times. Jesse took the stallion's reins the way a man shakes a hand he intends to know a long while. He ran a palm once down the neck, and the horse breathed the way a chest settles when a weight is lifted. There was temptation in that leather, a stronger future than the one he had walked toward for years. He felt it, and did not despise himself for feeling it. He also felt the bristle of suspicion from the window's slice that moment thinner. A man like him with a horse like this was a story the town would want to explain to itself in small, suspicious words. He kept his hand gentle, his mouth quiet, and he let the leader see the gratitude without making the gratitude a debt. "What do I call you?" Jesse asked the scout softly, because having no name to set to a face he would remember felt wrong. The youth's mouth tilted. "They call me many ways," he said in Spanish first, and then he tried the English as if tasting a frontier food. "Miguel, in the town of the traders. My mother calls me something that is for my house and my fire. You can call me Miguel." He glanced back at the leader. "He is Hastian Nashdoitso to some, but here you can say the one who leads today. It is enough." "Hastian," Jesse repeated as respectfully as his tongue could make it, and then gave the scout's chosen name the weight of use. "Miguel, tell him I know what a gift is. Tell him I'll make good use of it in the direction of his wish." Miguel carried the sense of it with grace. The leader listened and then answered with a thin smile that withheld judgment because judgment could wait. He gestured to the line of riders behind him. 7 men broke from the ark with spears balanced along their thighs. They rode forward at a respectful pace and stepped down together, their feet finding the earth with a unity townsmen only ever share if a hymn master shouts them to it. Each man lifted his lance and set its butt into the ground between the crescent and the town, the points aimed towards sky, the feathers bound beneath the heads, stirring with the morning's small winds. Miguel translated without prompting, not because he thought Jesse could not see the meaning, but because a pledge is a thing you speak to make it hold. 7 lances stand, he said. 7 days is not what we ask. We ask 1 day, 1 son to 1 son. In this day there is no blood. She, he tipped his head toward the doctor's house, rests inside. If she heals inside the line made by your bodies and your word, our bodies and our word will hold this line also. If she is harmed or given to fear, the lances fall, and the day becomes a different day. He searched for a phrase and found one slightly crooked. He says the earth remembers promises stuck into it. Avery exhaled in a way only men who have shuffled between barroom brawls and barroom truces know how to exhale, like the cheapest miracle has been given the chance to start making itself. He lifted his hand, not high, not like a politician or a conductor, just enough, and said in a voice that kept its own fear on a short leash, 1 day, you have my word. He turned his head a quarter-inch toward the windows and did not have to say what the town heard. Put the barrels down. Let the day do its work. The moment, which ought to have bloomed, instead trembled like a soap film stretched too thin. Mercy made Silas McCrae itch. It stole the costume from the play he had already sold tickets to in his own mind. Peace, this early and this public, made him irrelevant. Irrelevance was a language he refused to learn. He moved along the edge of the crowd with a smile, like the back of a knife, and found Wade Cutter. Wade of the toothpick chewed to splinters. Wade with a vein in his temple that rose to attention at insult. Wade, who had once shot a rattler's head off a fence post for no better reason than boredom's dare. McCrae did not say fire. He did not need the sin of that syllable. He said something men say to other men when they want to borrow the parts of them that most easily break. "If a wolf comes quiet to the yard," he murmured as if narrating a fable, "a man shows the wolf where the noise lives." He let the phrase do the arithmetic in Wade's head. He gave him a reason poor enough to hide itself in a decent man's pocket. Inside the house, the woman's eyes had found the stallion's braided mane through the curtain and followed the movement of the leader's hand on the reins. She whispered again the name that had woken with her, and Evelyn, who had never walked a mile with that language in her ears, felt in her bones the relief braided through it. The doctor, too, felt the streets change, the way a surgeon senses when bleeding is ebbing beneath his fingers without having to look. He allowed himself the smallest sag of the shoulders and the smallest sip from the cup that had been cooling too long. Jesse took one more step closer to the line of lances and saw in the leader's eyes something he had not dared to hope for in the world he knew. Recognition not of his goodness, that word bagged too easily by men who wanted to sell him things, but of his exactness. He had done what he had done because it needed doing. That kind of arithmetic arranged him into a person the leader could bargain with. Bargains built from that place stand better than fences. "Tell him," Jesse said to Miguel, "that my horse had a good heart. This one—" He touched the stallion's neck again, laughed under his breath at the absurdity and the humility of the new strength standing suddenly under his hand. "This one has a long road in him. I'll spend it right." Miguel's mouth shaped the leader's language, and then Spanish, carrying the sense across with that delicate attention that makes clarity feel like kindness. The elders nodded. One of them sank to a knee and pressed his palm to the soil as though checking the day's pulse there. The leader looked toward the doctor's hedge again, studying the house as a man studies a canyon's face before choosing a line. He spoke, and Miguel added a ribbon to the pledge. He says, "At sundown he will come again with 2 women who can bring songs for sleep. They will sit outside the hedge where the lances can see them. They will not cross into the doctor's place unless asked." Jesse's throat went thick at that. This unexpected decency, tidy, respectful, competent. His life had mostly been built around the idea that kindness must elbow its way through loud rooms to get anything done. Here, it stood unshouted and structured. He looked back toward the sheriff, who had closed his eyes like a man stepping into shade after too long in a glare. He looked up toward the church, where McCrae watched with a face that had mislaid its amusement and now made a study of the angles of other men's shoulders. A hawk stitched a lazy figure overhead. The town began, just barely, to remember it had chores. A woman lifted a kettle and poured water on beans. A boy was sent to bring in a line of shirts. The blacksmith wiped a hand on his apron and gazed at his quiet anvil as if it were a friend he had wronged. Laughter, soft, incredulous, touched the corner by the bakery and then hid, shy of being heard by the wrong ears. You could feel in the street a recalibration, the day stepping out of a script and trying another one on, the kind of improvisation life prefers and fear despises. Wade Cutter, at the angle McCrae had chosen for him, felt nothing so precise as recalibration. He felt the itch that comes from being told to wait in a world that had given him a gun, supposedly, so he would never have to. He had grown up with the story of what to do when men on the flats made shapes larger than his people liked. The story was not a negotiation. It was a punctuation. He wanted a period, the fat, decisive dot at the end of the sentence that would let him quit thinking. The lances looked like exclamation points that did not belong to him. He squinted along the rifle's sight and told himself he would send his bullet into the sky like a church bell rung to clear the mind. McCrae watched Wade's shoulder notch into its familiar angle and said nothing. Saying nothing was the same as saying, "Go ahead," and it did not make his hands dirty. He was careful with his hands. Miguel turned his head because he heard something people who live close to each other's intentions hear, the small, almost polite taking up of slack in a trigger finger. Jesse saw the same movement a breath later and felt his stomach step toward the place where a horse might pivot if asked. He did not yet move the stallion. Moving would make panic run, and panic runs like wildfire in brush. The stallion's ear flicked. The horse belonged to the leader, yes, but it also belonged to itself, a sovereign. It knew metal's bite in the air the way Jesse knew the sound of certain lies. It gathered itself, a coil of readiness that tried to keep room for calm, even as the day around it shrank. Avery's hand crept up his thigh. He did not seize. He prepared, the way a man might curl his fingers near a lantern he intends to snuff without breaking the glass. At the window, Evelyn put her palm to the woman's shoulder and pressed down very gently, not to restrain, but to promise that the bed would hold. The woman's eyes, clear now, widened with the intuition of what towns do when a small man reaches for loudness to make himself tall. The leader stood with his hands open, empty, in the space between the lances and the deputyless law of money. He did not look at Wade, because to look at a man like that gives him a stage. He looked at Jesse, and something like patience passed between them, like a canteen. It was an agreement made without words. Hold. We can still hold this. Wade Cutter found his bell. He pulled the trigger to wake the town to the story he had come ready to star in. The rifle cracked, loud and sudden, cleaving the day's fragile quiet like a cleaver through bone. Sound slapped the windows. Doves blew out of the eaves in white panic. The stallion went vertical, forelegs scissoring the morning, braided mane snapping like a banner as his hooves cut the clean air into ribbons. The shot cracked the morning and tried to name it. Men flinched, and memory did what it always does with sudden loudness. It filled in too much. A second's worth of chaos came roaring out of old stories. Muzzles jerked to shoulders, mouths opened to swallow air that felt suddenly short. The stallion came down from his rear with a thunder that shook dust out of porch boards, eyes wide white. Jesse put his hand to the new horse's neck and felt a river under hide. Terror made muscle asking for a map. He gave the horse his breath to borrow. Easy, easy now. Rifles down! Sheriff Avery's voice was not big. It was exact, and it found its mark in the joints of men's hands. Down, I said. That wasn't mine. You don't make it yours. He did not draw. He put his palm up and opened it into the day, like a man offering a poultice. We got a pledge in the ground, he added, quieter, but the quiet sat in ears the way a nail sits in wood. Don't be the fool that pulls it loose. Wade Cutter was already finding the story he meant to tell about what he had just done. Warning, only a warning, smoke to let the wind know which way to blow. McCrae's eyes were bright with the success of a thing that had not quite succeeded. His smile returned like a coin to a pocket, saved for a purchase later. The crescent of riders did not break, not a single spear dipped. That discipline traveled across the distance and took the heat out of the town's panic, the way a cool hand will take it out of a child's brow. Jesse stepped farther into the space no one else wanted, the slot of air between muzzles in windows and the feathers trembling under the 7 iron points. He lifted his arms, not high, just enough to make of himself a hinge. "Hold," he said. And because he said it to the horse as much as to the men, and because the horse believed him, the word found a shape it might have missed if it had only been thrown at humans. The stallion's skin stopped rippling. The line of its neck softened from bow to bridge. The war leader waited until the echo left by Wade's shot finished bouncing off the false fronts and the mill house. Only then did he move. He stepped forward the way a man steps into a stream he knows the bottom of, testing nothing, trusting because he has earned the right to. He reached for the stallion's rein, not to take it away, but to lay his hand over Jesse's hand where the leather crossed. It was a gesture with the weight of old use, an old camp's way of saying, we own this calm together, or we don't own it at all. Miguel came up with him, eyes flicking to the windows in a quick tally of barrels and tempers. He translated with an economy that would have done for a scalpel. He asks you to walk with him, Miguel said. Just there. He angled his chin toward a low shelf of land beyond the lances, toward a mesquite whose shade was more intention than fact. Away from eyes that turn words into other words. Avery's jaw worked once, hard. He looked at Jesse and said nothing aloud, but the nothing contained a list a friend might carry into a burning barn. Go, but come back. Don't let them make you bigger than you are. Don't let us make you smaller than you must be. Jesse gave him a nod that said he had read the list and would mind it. He let the leader's hand stay where it was over the rein, and together they turned the stallion. The braids in the manes, black rope on the leader's mount, chestnut silk on the gift, swung like tassels on a thought. They rode at a pace that allowed watchers to tell themselves they were not watching. Jesse felt every eye on his back like light pressure from different fingers. He felt, too, the electric quiet from the line of warriors, the kind of quiet men use as a tool. When they had gone far enough that the town's breath sounded less like a crowd and more like wind, the leader lifted his hand, and the little party stopped in the thin patchwork shade. Up close, without windows between them, or the burden of being observed, the war leader's face resolved from legend into person. There were lines earned by laughter as well as lines minted by loss. There was a small nick at the ear that told a story he might never tell. The elder's eyes were quick and amused, wolf-old and boy-young at once. Miguel stood where he could see both men's mouths and both sets of hands. The leader spoke first, short phrases laid like stones. Miguel caught them and set them into what Jesse could hear. She is kin, he said, touching his own chest briefly, in the place above the heart that is common ground across languages. Sister's child. Her name is Alisos, in the talk traders understand. It is not the name my mother wrapped her in, but it will do for here. Alisos. The syllables carried water inside them. Jesse tried them with care and let them sit in his mouth like a seed he meant to plant. The name made the cot in the doctor's front room more than a piece of furniture holding a problem. It made it a place where a person lay. She followed a trail, Miguel went on, so small it would pull a nail out of a plank if you tried to carry it too fast. A child taken where the water always used to be. Here. He drew a crooked line in the dust with the toe of his boot, then another where the creek had shrunk away from last year's bank. Men in wagons who smell like barrels. They follow the dry. They were 3, then 4. They hide their tracks under our tracks and your tracks. He looked up. The apology not for the truth, but for having to say it. They sell labor. Sometimes they sell the child again, farther down the river, to men who do not care what river it is. Alisos went to find the child's name before the name fell out of the world. The leader spoke again, and Miguel frowned once as he chose words and got them right. He says white men put sticks in the ground with wire that bites. They keep the cows out and keep the water for their own. We make a way around. We do not like the way, but the way can be walked. Then men with hats like the sun. Miguel touched the brim of Jesse's and smiled without malice. Ride behind us and take horses and bread and say it was us. People in the town say it was us. Your rich man at the church, he jerked his chin back toward McCrae's spire, counts fear like cattle and sells it by the head. There it was, the outline drawn without polite shading, springs fenced and named as property, hired riders moving in the echo of other men's hoofbeats and wearing that echo like a mask. Jesse felt the creek's image rise in him, its slow green back, its one cool promise to every kind of thirst. And he understood in a way he had not allowed himself to understand before that the fence fight had always been about more than straight lines on a map. Water was a church that did not belong to a single denomination. To take it and sell it was blasphemy with numbers. He looked at the leader and did not try to furnish his gaze with apology he could not pay for. "The man with the church voice is named Silas McCrae," he said, "because names have their own work to do. He has wanted the creek since before he knew where it ran. He'll build a fence in the middle of another man's prayer if it turns his wheel." Jesse let the mayor's breath count his own. The dust on his tongue tasted like truths he had swallowed too often for comfort. "If I can put my body between his first try and his second, I will. But this town will spook easy if it thinks it's being crowded. Give me a day to stand her up, a lysos, and a day to teach men to listen to their fear without firing it. After that, we meet again with a shape we both agree to." Miguel translated, but there was less to carry across than it might have seemed. Some proposals present themselves in the hinge of a man's spine, and Hastin did not need every syllable to hear the hinge. He looked past Jesse at the tiny pretend tree's shade, up at a hawk that had found an honest thermal, then down at his elders. One old man smiled and said something short that even Jesse could tell amounted to, "Yes, boy, let us be clever today and brave tomorrow." The other lifted his chin in that particular nod populated places use when someone proposes a plan that lets people sleep with knives under pillows instead of in hands. The war leader extended his hand, palm up. Offer, not demand. Miguel folded the rest. "He says 3 sons would make the horses sigh. 1 son is the day in the ground. He gives you 3, because the healer is old and the bone is angry." The faintest humor bent his mouth. "He says no one of us will put a foot across the line where the hedges breathe your doctor's air. Not one woman, not one boy with an idea. For 3 days we will not take wood or water or a nail that does not belong to us inside your line, but he binds a cord around it. If anyone harms the woman, if anyone puts a hand on her with hunger instead of help, the 7 lances fall and the day becomes teeth. He asks you to say the words back so the earth can hear them twice." Jesse said them. He said them in English because that is where he had first learned how to make a promise sound like work he meant to finish. He said them in Spanish to show he understood that meaning can wear different coats and keep the same bones. He did not have the leader's language, so he touched his chest as the woman had touched hers and put his palm to the ground the way the elder had done. 3 days, he said. 3 days I hold her. 3 days you hold your line. If anyone breaks her safety, they break me first." Miguel stood straighter as the phrases found their shape. Hastian's eyes held Jesse's, and something like approval moved under the surface of them, like a big fish changing direction under a dark skin of water. The stallion blew softly and nosed Jesse's shoulder as if punctuating the agreement in a grammar horse's own. Behind them, so far that it felt like another county, the town shifted in its skin. Men needed to return to tasks, if only to give their nerves some distance from their teeth. One took a broom to his stoop, as if sweeping could keep day from tripping. Another oiled a door hinge, so it wouldn't squeal its panic to neighbors. McCrae walked 3 leisurely circles inside the church, as if he could wind rope around the day's waist and pull it to his preferred angle. When he came out, his coat sat more neatly across his shoulders, and his eyes had remembered how to calculate profits off outcomes he did not yet control. The talk at the mesquite turned to details, the small, respectful arrangements that make a promise live through the hour it's made in. 2 women would come at sundown and sing just outside the hedge. No weapons would be worn in sight of the doctor's window. If the sheriff wished to speak, he would bring 2 men only, and those men would eat bread handed to them by older hands before any words were answered. Bread to remind them they were more animal than argument. Jesse lifted the reins, because lifting them meant the talking here had reached a point where more words would tip the balance. The leader did the same. They turned back toward a town that could not quite decide whether it had been spared or fooled. Jesse felt something in him sit up, the part that usually stayed low to the ground out of habit. He was not building a fence or cutting wire. He was staking a day inside other men's tempers and asking it to stand. He had not known he could do that until he found himself arranging the syllables of it in his mouth. They rode back through the line of lances. The feathers flicked at the morning air as if beating time. The sheriff's face shifted half an inch toward ease when he saw Jesse's shoulders squared and his jaw not set in the rock clench of someone who had lost the shape of what he meant to say. Avery waited until they were nearly at the hedge, then stepped forward to meet them with his hand out. No badge touched, nothing theatrical. "Tell me," he said. Jesse told him within earshot of the men he needed to hear it, but not within range of McCrae's hungry grin. 3 days, he said. No foot across the line, no hand to our wood, no mouth to our water without asking. They'll keep their distance if we keep our hands out of the woman's fate. At sundown, 2 to sing for sleep. They'll sit where the lances can see them. In 3 days we meet again and pull something larger than this morning out of the same hat. Avery's eyes closed for a breath, as if he had just finished swallowing something that burned but would turn out to be medicine. He nodded. 3 days. I can preach to men who can count to 3, he said. He turned to the street and spoke in that dry way he had that made men straighten because they recognized their names inside the general address. We got a deal made on our front steps. For 3 days, your rifles respect my windows. If I find a bullet hole in Mrs. Habergen's shutters, I'll hang the rifle by its strap from the church bell, and you can all listen to your own foolishness clatter for a week. Women coming to sing at sundown ain't a threat. If your wife hears a lullaby and gets mean about it, that's a different argument I won't mediate. There was laughter, the real kind, with the frail hand of relief tucked in it. Men who had wanted to be told to be decent were grateful to be reminded they had signed on for it. From the church porch, McCrae watched a day slip out from under the weight he had put on it and learned to breathe on its own. He did not change color. He did not shout. He put his hat on and began to redeal the cards in his head. If peace paid him less now, he would make it pay later by another name. He signaled to Wade Cutter, 2 fingers, a little twitch that meant, not here, not now. I have a different place picked out for loudness. Inside the doctor's house, the old man checked the splint with fingers as exact as lathwork. Evelyn's lips moved with a tune she had not known she remembered from a childhood that had smelled like yeast and lavender. Alisos looked at the window as if memory itself had come to stand there and lean on the sill. When Jessie stepped back through the door to fetch water from the barrel and report, her gaze found his and did not look away. He did not know the words for the look she gave him, but he received it into himself like food that would keep until needed. He put himself to work, small work that feels like an oath repeated. He filled the kettle and the pitcher, fetched clean cloth from the shelves for Evelyn's bent, careful hands, repacked the saddlebag that had sagged open by the stove, now holding the shape of a man's life that had been emptied and refilled without fanfare. Every motion seemed to find a place inside the promise he had just made under the mesquite. The promise carried him better than the horse could, this hour at least. McCrae drifted along the town's edges, like smoke from a fire that has never admitted to being set. He let his men see him smile at nothing in particular, let them hear him speak low about logistics that had nothing to do with the day's mercy. Supply runs, head counts, the mill's belt and how it needed oil. He did not even look toward the creek, which is a way cunning men keep secrets, by refusing to glance at them in daylight. 2 of his riders, obedient by habit and by the fear of being made to look small, peeled off toward the north, where the creek bent like a spoon someone had leaned on. Wade Cutter was one of them. The other was a man with no fixed name. Men called him Rook because he moved like his joints had only learned right angles. They set their horses to a trot that could be kept up by men who wished later to say they had not been in a hurry. They took the road that pretended to be nothing but a road. They left it 2 miles out and cut down into the wash, where cottonwoods knitted a partial shade that made everything under it feel sly. The creek talked in its august voice, low and private. The air stank faintly of kerosene, where a leaky can had been poured too generously on last week's fence posts to keep the beetles from making them hollow. Wade found what he had come half hoping and half dreading to find. Canvas thrown over a stack that was not river rock. A neat bundle of posts with fresh ends red as meat where the saw had kissed them yesterday, and behind them, hidden only by the pretense of hiding, 3 wooden crates with copper wire stapled along the lids and the stenciled letters of a far-off city bleeding through dust. Dynamite sits in a place, like a man who believes he is the smartest in the room. It makes the room dumb around it. Rook whistled once, a note without music. "That a lot of fence for 3 days," he said, not because he did not know the answer, but because saying it put a shape around what they were about to do. "And a lot of bang for keeping cows polite." Wade squatted and laid his palm on the canvas, as if he could feel the night inside the plan through the weave. He could. Night lay there in the crates, and the kind of night that does not bother to bring stars. He imagined the line of posts marching across the creek like a procession of little gods. Imagined the dynamite's clean, cheap solution to rock and root. One hard noise, and the earth agreeing to be moved. He thought of the lances in the ground back at town, and of the sound they would make if they fell together. For a split second, 2 stories tried to live in him at once, and found there was only room for one. He chose the one he had practiced more. He stood and spat in the dust, a performance for Rook, and for the version of himself he liked best. "Tonight," he said, "when the singing's got 'em looking the other way, we set posts while the sheriff reads them lullabies. By morning, we got a gate where a river used to be." Rook picked up a coil of wire and tested its bite on his thumb. It bit like it meant it. "McCrae'll be pleased. That's what he pays for," Wade said. He tugged the canvas back over the crates and patted it once, almost tender, as if tucking a child into a bed the child had not earned. He looked up through the lattice of leaves toward the slice of sky and judged a time only men who live outside bothered to name. "We come back when the bell's on second prayer. Bring 4 more men. Bring the sledge." He paused, attending to a sensation that pricked at him like a burr. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the knowledge that the day had rearranged its furniture, and he kept bumping his shin. He pushed it away. "Bring whiskey. Men set posts easier when their tongues forget their mouths." They rode back slow to keep dust from raising an alarm. Along the way, a jackrabbit cut a crazy line across their front hooves and vanished into sage as if the plant had swallowed it whole. Wade laughed and took the escape as a good sign for himself. The creek fell quiet behind them in the way of witnesses that have learned usefulness keeps them alive. At town, the lances stood, the 7 thin trees that had grown in an hour and promised to shade hotter tempers than their leaves could manage. Children, forbidden to look, managed to look anyway, and then found each other to whisper the discovery that men had not died yet, where death had said it would wait. The baker put extra sugar on a tray of shortcakes as if sweetness could be braided into the afternoon like ribbon. A dog lay under a wagon and made long, satisfied noises, having discovered peace is better for the bones than alarm. Jesse felt the shape of a new weight in him and did not dislike it. It was not the weight of shame or necessity, it was the heft of responsibility, which, when it sits right, balances a man instead of bending him. He caught himself speaking softer, as if volume might spook the fragile luck that had come to sit on the porch rail. He answered questions as they came. From the sheriff about how the meeting had been, from Evelyn about how to make the ground outside the hedge soft enough for sitting without damp rising into old hips, from the doctor about whether the scouts' women would carry herbs he did not have in his cabinet. He even gave a plain answer to a boy who asked whether the stallion could count. And when the boy laughed because horses do not count, he said, "They do. Breaths and steps, the ones that matter." Toward evening, as the light moved from the color of tin to the color of ripe wheat, the 2 women came and sat where they had said they would sit. They were ordinary and extraordinary in the way all good things are. Hair braided, hands nicked by work, voices that started small and found their own size without help. They sang not for the town, but for the sick room. And yet the town eavesdropped on the comfort and could not help being comforted by it. Men who suspected themselves of believing in nothing felt their throats thicken with something they could not name, and that cost them nothing to admit in the privacy of their own mouths. McCrae made a show of not hearing. He shut his church door and counted the receipts for a fair that had not yet opened. When he stepped out at last, his hat brim cut a thin slice out of the last light. He nodded to Wade, who had appeared in the shadow between the blacksmiths and the livery, with that air men have when they are both ready and forgiven ahead of time. Wade nodded back. The moon, skinny and interested, lifted itself up where the sky had not quite decided to be blue or black. The day that had been held together by a man's small oath and 7 sticks in the ground came to the hour where such holdings usually fail. The town slept in pieces, like a quilt made from more colors than match. Jesse dozed with his boot heels hooked on the bottom rung of a chair, his head tipped against the window frame, one ear trained on the room behind him, the other on the street that could still break. He thought of the creek, though he had not been asked to, saw it in his mind, half-dressed in moonlight, and he could nearly hear the careful, criminal sound of wire unspooling. He opened his eyes to the same room he had closed them on and found that the difference was only inside him. He was not waiting for orders anymore. He was setting them in himself, and he knew exactly where the first would point if anyone asked, to water, where men make their truest mistakes because they think necessity excuses the shape of them. Far off, in a fold of land designed by convenience to hide industry, the canvas on 3 crates shrugged under the breeze like something alive. The fence posts lay like a congregation waiting for the sermon. The creek muttered to itself in the old tongue. And down the road, 4 silhouettes collected against the sky where it lay low, whips of wire over their shoulders, their feet proving the night with that worker's rhythm that says, "Do it quick, do it now. Do it before morning can argue." Night came down with a mind of its own, not the soft kind that pours itself into cracks and lets a town sleep, but the taut hide of darkness pulled over the land until every sound had to push to get through. The singing outside the hedge had dwindled into a hum that lived on the air even after the women had gone. The doctor's stove ticked as if counting prayers. Somewhere a wagon chain clinked with the dream of daytime use. Jesse dozed and woke, and dozed again, in the chair by the window, his hat brim tipping shadows across his eyes, one heel hooked on the rung, the other planted as if bracing against a wind he could feel under the door. Beyond the last lamps of town, the black carried men whose intentions did not glow. Wade Cutter and Rook and 2 more slid along the cottonwoods like a rumor refusing to be caught. Each had wrapped his boots with cut rawhide stitched deep with bits of burlap, so that the prints would read like something that had walked these arroyos for generations, not like the blunt confession of a heel and a half-moon iron. In their pockets, small bundles of goose quill painted with cheap red and a strip of porcupine quills bought off a peddler with bad teeth, a sign for men in daylight who needed daylight's help to believe. On their belts, because work is work no matter how you speak of it later, a flask, a knife, a starter's stick, and for Wade matches his father would have called city courage. The line cabin sat where a drawer shouldered up to the rise before the north pasture, a 1-room box with a porch too shallow for comfort and a stovepipe that had not smoked in a week because the ranch hand assigned to it had gone to town to sell a saddle and press his shirt and maybe make eyes at a girl who liked men in clean collars. Wade felt along the jam with careful fingers until he found the weakness all quick builds have. Rook shouldered once, twice. Wood sighed and agreed. They were inside, with the quiet of men who have opened trouble like this before and do not need to teach their hands. Wade upended a crate of split kindling onto the bed and broke chair legs with a savagery that felt like relief. He had told himself all day that it would be fence work first, posts and wire, and the crisp logic of a line. But fear was a better tool, and McCrae paid him to use the best stock first. He took the porcupine strip from his pocket and nailed it to the lintel beside the busted latch with a single tidy tack. He whipped a few strokes of red across the door and the bare table edge to look like the war paint the town expected. Too bright, too wet, too much. The way lies flare when men who have never seen the truth try to copy it. Then he tore a handful of goose quills and stuck them into a crack between boards as if someone had stored them there for later. Rook scattered ash from a little sack at the threshold, ground sage and char that would smell right enough to noses trained only by prejudice, and then helped the others pile wood under the mattress. Wade struck his match on the sole of his boot because theatrics pleased him when the audience was only himself. The flame took the shavings, as a kind thing takes a compliment. Then it climbed the edges of the mattress, as if remembering the path from a childhood spent watching kitchen fires grow up. They left with the easy speed of men who know how long a building takes to learn it is doomed. Out on the porch, Wade hung a little loop of yucca weave from a nailhead and allowed himself one last look at the square of glow that was a window beginning to practice being a mouth. It suited him. He felt the night open, felt the story begin to walk home ahead of him to tell on itself. By the time the smoke reached a black finger into the stars and the light had matured to the color a lie turns when it believes itself more than its maker, Wade and his men were back on the road and cantering toward town, with news practiced down to syllables. At the church, Silas McCrae had summoned a midnight meeting with the same ease he used to call men to supper when there was pork on the table. He stood at the front with his coat off for once, sleeves rolled, cuffs soot black, where he had slapped a burning poker in a demonstration no one asked for. The gesture was so precisely calibrated, look upon my heroic soot, that even God might have been tempted to admire the math. Settle, he told them, and men who had come with the pleasure of being scared curdled their fear down to shape and sat. Bad news likes to be spoken standing. I'll keep mine standing and short. And he held up an arm, and the room saw the ash on his cuff before it heard his words. Line cabins gone, took under like dry tinder does, sign all over it, paint, quill, mock track. Don't need me to teach you your letters, you can read the message. Whispers burned faster than the cabin had. A man at the back said Indians in a voice that slid off the pew like grease. Another said 70 and counted the lances even though there had only ever been 7. McCrae didn't shush them. He let the fear do some of his work, and then he put the rest in his pocket with the confidence of someone whose pockets always have room. Sheriff Tom Avery came in late because he had spent the first dark hour walking the street and the second at the doctor's hedge, and men who spend time like that arrive without spectacle. His hat was still on his head and his hands were clean. He took in the soot, the faces, the smell of smoke on men who had not been at any fire but this one, and said, "What happened?" McCrae did not answer him so much as answer the room. "What always happens when law goes soft," he said, not pointing at Avery, but drawing a circle the sheriff's boots found themselves inside. "We got emboldened enemies, and a town told to keep its barrels off windows while savages write their name on our property. And now our property is ashes." Avery chewed once, hard enough that the muscle along his jaw might have been stone. "You see the men who did it?" he asked Wade, because Wade's face wore the shine of someone who wants to be the first mouth with the news. Wade spread his hands in a demonstration of clean palms. "Saw what they wanted us to see," he said. "You know how they are. Left their feathers, left their marks. Hell, they left the idea of themselves in the smoke like a signature." The sheriff looked at the man as if the soul inside him could be seen through the shirt. "You can lie to yourself till the lie starts feeding you," he said. "Don't bring it to my table if you expect me to eat." He turned to McCrae. "You want to catch arsonists? We ride to the cabin at first light, look at prints before Story gets there with its muddy boots. We don't turn the sick out of the doctor's house as an answer to somebody else's crime." McCrae's smile thinned, and he emptied a pinch of soot from his cuff onto the floorboards, like a person praying over a meal. "While you examine philosophical tracks, Tom, the rest of us will handle the present tense. They want leverage. We show them they don't get it from our shelves. We take the woman into custody and hold her at the church until her people..." He made the word a wall. Lose interest, or make a mistake the law understands. That's clean. That's controlled. That's what a town does when it respects itself. The word custody performed exactly as he needed it to. Men who would have balked at kidnap for leverage found themselves nodding because the syllables wore a necktie. Fear leaned forward eagerly, elbows on knees, and reason hunted for its hat. Avery set his hat on the pew in front of him and stood with his hands hanging open. "We have 3 days on the ground in front of the doctor's house," he said. "We break that and we don't have anything but noise. You take a sick woman from a sickbed, you'll have blood in a room where I won't allow it. I won't put gun barrels that close to a healer's lamp." McCrae made a noise like a man being asked to admire a child's drawing when he was balancing accounts. "Then you won't put barrels anywhere, is that it? You'll be the man who watched the river go dry because his conscience preferred music to measurement." He turned to the men in the pews with the verve of a traveling preacher who knows when the room is ready to be saved. "We are deputizing for a simple duty. Secure our town's hostage so our town can negotiate from a position of strength. If the sheriff will not sign, I will. If his badge won't do, mine will. We don't need his paper to know our rights." Avery looked at the faces he had memorized. The man who had once sobbed in his office because his boy had cracked the neighbor's calf with a slingshot stone. The woman who had stood in this very aisle and begged Avery to let her son off a drunken charge with a warning. He thought of the lances in the ground like upright prayers. He tasted the shape of the blood that would be in the air if guns walked into Nathaniel Carter's front room. He took his badge off as if he were lifting a splinter from his own palm, careful, not in anger. "I won't carry this into a sick room," he said. His voice did not tremble, and it did not preach. It laid the words like bricks because men needed to see how they could hold. "If you boys go in there, you go without me. If you spill blood, you do it with your own names. I won't have it on mine." He set the badge on the edge of the pulpit and stepped back, suddenly looking both lighter and older. There was a brief, brave silence before fear remembered itself. Then it voted loud. Hands went up, mouths said aye, heads turned to the man whose money felt like a future and not, as it had always truly been, a debt. McCrae smiled modestly and accepted power like a man in a pew accepts the Lord's Supper, confident it will absolve him later. He named 10 men, then 5 more just to make the number muscular, and he called them deputies by the power vested in him by cash and the willingness of other men to let cash be a crown. Jesse heard the meeting come apart through the church walls the way a horse hears a storm drilling nails into far roofs. He set the cup he hadn't realized was in his hand back on the sill and turned to the doctor. "They'll come," he said. "They'll try to take her as proof they still know how to spell their names." Nathaniel Carter did not look up from the binding he adjusted. "I have practiced medicine in places where men confused my doorway with a jury box," he said. "I have no taste for that confusion here." He glanced at Jesse. "You'll need to go to the ridge." "Leave her?" Jesse almost didn't recognize his own voice. How it stuck, how it wanted to be 2 men at once, one who stayed and one who ran to warn. Evelyn touched his arm, and in that touch there was more instruction than a sermon could hold. "You keep your promise 2 ways, she said. "By guarding this door and by holding the other end of the rope you tied out there with your mouth. Go. Tell them what men intend in the dark. Ask them to wait for a dawn that lets truth be seen on the ground." She handed him a heel of bread wrapped in a rag and the canteen, as if she was sending him across nothing more dangerous than a pasture with a cranky bull. He left the stallion with a pat and took the dun because a tired horse can remember a rider's mind better than a fresh one, and tonight he needed remembering. The street had torches in it now, the kind of light that breaks men into pieces and makes their faces look like masks. He rode through between those masks and kept his hands visible and empty. At the lances, Miguel stepped from shadow as if the dark had learned where he kept his bones. "What has the town decided to be?" the scout asked, blunt because time had teeth. "Frightened and righteous," Jesse said. "Silas has them wound like wire. A line cabin's gone. Your sign left where every fool can see. They'll be coming to lift her out of the bed and call it law." Miguel's mouth tightened and then eased. We saw the smoke. We said the word trap 3 different ways. Hastian said the word patience 5. He whistled for the leader, who moved forward with the soundless weight of a man who can rearrange fear by standing in front of it. The elders came too, their eyes thick with the kind of thinking that has saved and cost lives in equal measures. Jesse told it plain. He did not try to dress the framing with apology, because apology for a thing you did not do wastes the time a man like Hastian uses to measure the day. He told them about the soot on McCrae's cuffs, about the swift deputizing, about the badge left sitting like a small moon on the pulpit's edge. I'm asking for your patience, he finished, not your forgiveness. Your patience buys me enough minutes to keep a bed a bed and not a battleground. Hastian turned his head toward town. Torches were gathering like a second, angrier constellation. The songs of the women were gone now, replaced by the clatter of decisions that excited the men making them. He spoke, and Miguel translated his answer with the dignity of someone entrusted with expensive glass. He says, your sheriff took his badge off to keep blood inside a house. That is a thing we see. That is a thing that smells like honor. He says, you go back with men at your side, not behind you, not hidden, 4 only. No young ones who want stories. If the town sees us, it will be in the number that keeps a promise and not the number that breaks it. Jesse swallowed shame with the same effort it takes to swallow hard bread. It scratched all the way down. He had not brought danger. Danger had been waiting for him to create the right shape to step into, but he had made a vow and then asked for it to be honored in a world determined to accuse him for the trying. I'm sorry, he said, and the apology was not for the framing or for McCrae's ambition, but for the simple fact that the hearth where he had promised safety would now be asked to hold more heat than it should. Miguel looked at him as if to say that some kinds of sorry outgrow the men who think they own them. The 4 who came forward to escort Jesse were not the fastest or the loudest. They were the kind with faces that had learned to go still and stay that way. One was old enough to make Jesse's teeth hurt with envy of his patience. They moved like a thought, separating itself from a tangle and going where it must. At the lances they stopped, because a line only works if you feel it under your feet. Jesse rode on alone into the mouth of a street that had decided it was a throat for swallowing. The posse had not even tried to hide its shape. Men like McCrae wanted their violence to look official. They dressed it in torches and titles. New tin stars had been cut from old cookie sheets and pinned to vests that had not earned the weight. Wade stood at the front with a paper folded in his hand like a script. The church bell did not ring because no one wished to argue with the sound it might make about sanctity. There were 20 men, and then there were 30, because numbers breed when they smell purpose. Sheriff Avery stood in his shirt sleeves beside the doctor's hedge. Without the badge, he looked taller, which was a trick of the eye and also a truth. Don't do it, he said, not pleading, just advising like a neighbor at a fence line. You go through that door, you go through me. Wade grinned around the toothpick he had not replaced since the meeting, perhaps because he thought it made him look busy, even when he was only cruel. He lifted the folded paper. We got authority, he said, signed and witnessed by men who care enough to write their names. Stand aside, Tom. You ain't the only decent here. Authority you can fold in your pocket is easy to carry, the sheriff said. This door has a different weight. He did not reach for the handle because he knew hands can be misread. He stood by it and let the door know it had a friend. Evelyn, through the window, had set the sick room for siege without making it look like one. Water, cloth, lamp turned low, a chair wedged where a shoulder would meet resistance if it tried to argue with wood. Nathaniel Carter sat on the cot like a rock in a river. Everything must pass by him to get anywhere worth going. Alisos slept the deep, heavy sleep of bodies that have decided pain and effort can postpone their quarrel until morning. Jesse stepped onto the porch, and the porch recognized the weight of him and did not creak. Evening, Wade, he said, because naming a man can sometimes shrink him down to his own shirt size. You got something that needs reading. You can read it from there. Paper doesn't travel like a bullet. Wade unfolded the script as if it were a show bill. By authority of the... He hesitated, because the thing he meant to say sounded silly in his mouth, even to him. "The Temporary Committee for Town Safety. We are to take into protective custody." The phrase gave him pleasure. The Indian woman residing at present in the doctor's front room. She will be housed in the church under guard until such time as her people behave themselves in a manner consistent with civilized negotiation. "Civilization don't start with stealing the weak," Avery said. His voice had a scythe's cleanliness. McCrae stood further back, hat brim low, mouth gentle as if tasting mint. "Tom, we all hear your conscience humming," he said. "Let the rest of us hear our children sleep. Step aside." Jesse looked past the men, over shoulders, beyond the torchlight, and he could see on the ridge the faint shapes of the four who had walked with him, kneeling with that impossible stillness that looks like stone until it moves and shows itself to be flesh. The lances farther out made a thin black picket against the indigo. He put a hand to the doorknob and left it there, warm. He thought of the night he had chosen to wake a woman, to carry her weight, to send his horse into a future he had not measured. He felt all the versions of himself gather behind his spine and agree. "Boys," he said. And when he said boys, a few men bristled because they had learned to bristle at being made smaller even when they were. "This door isn't a number you can bully. It's a promise. That promise has a rope tied to those lances and to the men who put them there. You go through, you cut it, and the pieces are going to turn into snakes that don't care who they bite." Wade showed his teeth. "You trying to spook us with magic? I'm trying to teach you math," Jesse said. "One woman, one door, one town's word. You tip that ledger and you won't like the balance." Men shifted. Torches hissed like snakes do when the wind runs across their tongues. McCrae made a tiny motion with his hand, nothing so coarse as a command, just a suggestion with a direction. The men with the makeshift badges moved to the porch steps and spread the idea of their weight across the boards. Someone at the back called, "Open in the name of the committee," and it did not sound like a farce because fear had turned it into a kind of law. Sheriff Avery set his back to the wood beside Jesse. He did it the way he did everything else, without posing, without a speech to go with it. "This is the wrong place to be brave," he said into the air, and it was unclear whether he meant the porch or the men on it. Inside, Evelyn lifted Alisos's hand and set it back down and put her other hand over it. "You are safe," she said again, not because she believed a sentence could hold back a crowd, but because sentences like that keep a room arranged while men outside confuse themselves. The doctor reached for his pocket watch and did not look at it, and closed it with an audible click that made the sick room's time the only time that mattered. Wade lifted his boot and put it on the bottom step. The posse ringed the hedge. McCrae's men fanned out to the sides, new tin stars glinting like counterfeit constellations. The church bell, uncaring, waited above them for wedding or funeral and did not pick sides. A wind came off the flats and carried with it the thin metallic smell of river stones that had not yet been forced to move. And from the ridge, the silhouettes held their posts with the patience of animals who actually live here. The new deputies demanded entry in the Baron's name, and the clinic's door, being only wood and a knob and the oath of those who stood before it, had to decide what it could be. They came like men, convinced that wood will forgive them, because it has so often yielded to their shoulders before. The door took the first blow with a surprised grunt, and the second with a crack that traveled up its grain like a split in ice. Sheriff Avery said once more, "Last chance," and the words had the feel of a man's back against a barn during a storm. Useful if you're inside his arms, insufficient if you're marching with lightning. Wade Cutter lifted his boot and drove it where hinges confess their weakness. The latch tore, the chair Evelyn had wedged against it skittered sideways, and the door gave the way a rib gives when it has been asked rudely too many times. Men spilled in with torches held stupidly high, as if fire could be persuaded not to behave like itself. Jesse did not go for his gun. He had not worn one into this room, and that had felt like a victory earlier in the day. He moved to make himself larger than his actual body, arms out, voice low. Easy, easy, where are your mother's boys? Wade's answer was the butt of a rifle swung short and fast toward Jesse's shoulder. He turned enough to make Bone take most of it and still felt the white jolt that blotted the edges of the room for a breath. He kept his feet, which matters to men watching other men as they decide who they will be. Evelyn's voice did not rise. "You will not touch her," she said, and the sheer calm in it made two of the men look toward their boots, as if perhaps their laces required them immediately. Another pushed past her with that helpless malice men bring into rooms where women stand without being frightened. Nathaniel Carter stepped from the cot to set himself where a wall ought to be. Wade shoved him aside with a palm. The old man returned as if shoved by a spring. "No," he said, and the word earned him a fist in the temple from Rook, who already regretted how much satisfaction it gave him. Nathaniel went down to one knee and then up again like a tide. "You will not touch her," he repeated, and this time he used his doctor's voice, the one he put on when he told children to put out their tongues. Wade struck him full across the mouth with the rifle stock. Teeth clicked like chips of porcelain in the quiet that followed. Outside, the lances stood. On the ridge, the four escorting figures turned their heads at the same instant, and Miguel whispered something in a language that kissed the back of his teeth in alarm and restraint. Inside, Jesse found Wade's wrist with one hand and the rifle barrel with the other, and levered both down, not to hurt, just to interrupt the ritual of force. Wade snarled, because the interruption wounded him in a more interesting part of himself than skin. Four more men rushed the cot. Evelyn got one by the ear and twisted until his eyes watered. He would later claim he'd been struck by an unknown assailant to preserve dignity for his kin. Another caught Jesse low behind the knee with a boot, coward's quickness, and Jesse folded to one elbow, his fingertips sliding under the cot frame to find purchase enough to keep the bed from sliding with the men who reached for Alisos. Alisos cried out once, not the high scream of panic, a sound thrown from deep inside a torn place. The room found its wrong with that syllable. The men still lifted her. Nathaniel went at Wade as if old bones could bite. Wade, surprised into honesty, hit him as if the doctor's persistence were the real insult of the evening. Blood wet the old man's lip. A fair amount made its way across his beard in a color that the lamplight made indecent. Sheriffs can pick the worst place to be brave. Avery chose exactly that place. He came through the mess, hands open, and took Wade by both shoulders and placed him into another part of the room with a calm that did not ask permission. "No more of that," he said. "You want to feel tall. Stand on a chair like a child and get it over with." Wade went for Avery's throat. Another deputy grabbed Avery's arms from behind because courage looks like waste to men who have tamed their fear by obeying it. Tin stars shone in the lamplight with the false promise of holiness. McCrae appeared in the doorway then, hat in hand like respect, and admired the ruin as a shopkeeper admires a display that will move product. "Gentlemen," he said, and the word waddled into the room with just enough money behind it to pass. "No one is here to be a brute. We are here to secure what the law requires." "The law requires you to leave a patient in a bed," Nathaniel said. He had a split along his cheekbone now that wept salt and made his right eye water in quiet outrage. "This town will be worth less in 1 hour if you forget that." McCrae tilted his head and let sorrow pass across his face like a cloud. "Doctor, no one questions your calling. We merely question the wisdom of hosting a treaty under your roof. The church was built for negotiations with heaven and can accommodate a smaller conference with our neighbors." "It wasn't a treaty," Jesse said. He felt his words slur very slightly around the tooth he had bitten hard when the rifle stock had found his shoulder. It was a promise men made because they were tired of dying at their own doorstep. He saw Evelyn's hands at Alisos's shoulders, steadying what could be steadied as rough palms closed on the blanket and slid it under her. He saw the woman's eyes half open, lucidity fighting for an inch in the flood. He put himself between the cot and the door and met each man in turn with his chest and his eyes. "You don't want to carry the scent of this room on you," he told them. "It won't wash easy." They did anyway. The cot bumped the doorframe and the jam caught the bandage, and Alisos bit her lip until a line of red appeared, thin as a part in her hair. Evelyn made a noise as if someone had pinched a nerve in her hand. Nathaniel took one staggering step after the men, and another, and then had to hold the doorway upright because it had suddenly stopped doing that simple job on its own. Sheriff Avery did not move from his post by the hinges until the last man with the cot passed. Then he stepped into Wade Cutter and put a palm flat to his breastbone. "You're in front of me now," he said. "Whatever happens outside, it happens with your name first." Wade grinned, liking the shape of his name when it walked in front of things. "Then it'll be a name people learn," he said, and he knocked the sheriff's hand aside, enjoying more than he should have the feel of good tendons under his fist. They marched Jesse with his wrists tied together in front, like a man politely carrying his own argument, the rope scratching the raw bands under his belt, where he'd earlier tied himself to a stirrup to keep a stranger alive. Outside, the stallion threw his head and tried to rear again against the press and the heat. The dun nickered softly, as if to remind itself that the world had not been trained to end in one afternoon. The lances on the flats were black ink marks against a sheet of sky, the color of old tin. The town had crowded to watch shame be carried past. Shame pretended to be a parade so it could borrow applause. The jail was a 2-cell box that had once been a storage room behind a feed store. It smelled like old corn and new iron, and the bitter tang of men's breath burned by fear. They put Jesse in one cell, and because McCrae also liked to humiliate while pretending to respect propriety, they put Alisos in the other, on a cot that had dipped too long under the same man's body, and now tried unfairly to hold the shape of one who had thrown up there. Evelyn came as far as the threshold with a basin and a look that made even Wade step an inch to the side. "I stay," she said. "If you intend this as custody, you give the jailer his tool. This is mine." McCrae, demonstrating how generous his power could be when it did not cost him, inclined his head. Evelyn crossed into the cell past the bars and the rope and the noise, and collected the woman's heat into her hands and made the room church again. Nathaniel was not allowed past the door. He tried, and Wade's forearm found his collarbone. The old man took that wound like an insult and said, almost to himself, "I have delivered children in tents, where men held rifles at the flap, and I have washed the feet of the dying in rooms men were ashamed to call their own. I will not." Then Wade hit him because words like that go to parts of a man he did not plan on having changed tonight. Nathaniel crumpled with a slow loss of joints, like a puppet whose strings have been cut one by one, which is a hard way for a proud back to meet wood. "You will not," Evelyn said, and it was unclear what she forbade, yet the room understood anyway. She crawled under the bars the way a cat might, basin tucked tight, and when she rose inside with Alisos, she did not look at Wade again. Men who do harm sometimes require an audience. She denied him the pleasure. Silas McCrae came to Jesse's bars as if visiting a curiosity in a museum he contributed to. He had borrowed a deputy's star and pinned it somewhere light could find it, far from where blood could. He held a paper that had already been folded in a way that would leave creases for years. "Mr. Hale," he said, with the courteous distance a man uses when he is about to do something impolite, "you have trafficked with enemies under the guise of philanthropy. You have obstructed officers of the committee. You have endangered property and calm. You have, in short, made yourself a story people will enjoy for a day and forget for a lifetime." "Some stories get into the groundwater," Jesse said. He could feel the ache in his shoulder arguing with the ache in his jaw, and both of them belonged to useful work if you looked at them from the right side. "They drink different, even years later." "Poetry," McCrae said gently, heartwarming. "Ineffective." He unfolded the paper. "By the power of the committee duly assembled, and until such time as the territorial judge may pass through, I sentence you to hang at first light for conspiracy with hostiles and interference with lawful arrest. I will make your case well to the judge when he comes, that we did what we had to do." Men like judges appreciate that language. Jesse thought of first light as a thing with feathers, birds waking in eaves, the steel blue cool of it laid across troughs. It felt wrong to imagine his own weight added to that calm. He held on to the image anyway, because it kept panic from building its scaffold inside him before the men outside could hammer theirs. "You could spare the town the mess," McCrae added in a voice pitched only for Jesse's ear as he slid the paper back into its envelope. "You could sign here." He produced another document, as if gifts were equal in the box. A quitclaim. Narrow, precise. Not a decency for decency. Nothing so sentimental. A practical admission, witnessed by an officer, that the watercourse known locally as Miller's Creek and the Spring Head Waters belong to and shall be managed by the McCrae Consolidated Company for the purposes of the mill and cattle preservation. An acknowledgement by a party who has demonstrated, shall we say, an understanding with the people presently arranged outside our town. That signature would be read as peace-loving. It would be applauded by men who read newspapers. It would also commend me to mercy. Your rope could stay in its coil and your neck in your shirt. Jesse laughed once, softly, because the structure of that blackmail was so tidy, it had the elegance of good carpentry. "I don't hold title to that water," he said. "Even you need a signature that actually belongs to the thing." McCrae's mouth admired Jesse for a full heartbeat. He adored a mind that could admire the quality of a trap while refusing it. "Title is a costume," he said. "It must fit on the stage. Off stage, men wear what they like." He tapped the paper. "This makes you a man of peace in the eyes of those who do not have to drink what you drain. It makes me a man of foresight. The judge will call it a reasonable exchange. He will mention the sheriff's dereliction and cluck and sign. Your friend with the badge will be turned into an anecdote, and I will have a more reliable deputy by then. You will ride away on that pretty horse and tell yourself you earned a second chance with a pen. And what of her?" Jesse wanted to ask him. "And what of the woman whose body you have turned into a pawn?" He did not give McCrae the leverage of that plea. He let silence do the speaking, the kind that stretches out like a rope across a canyon and invites a man to step blithely into air. McCrae did not step. He withdrew without irritation. "First light," he said, and the phrase landed in the cell like a folded blanket he expected Jesse to lay his head on. The jailer, who had been deputized this evening into knowing which keys were which, installed himself on the chair by the door and pretended to be made of hardwood rather than a farm boy whose hands still remembered peaches. The hammering started then in the yard, an honest music employed by a dishonest cause. Men had carried rough lumber from behind the livery where it had been waiting to be a stall and a fence. Now it would be a more dramatic architecture. The gallows went up like crude theater built to speed the plot. Every thump landed in Jesse's ribs. Every saw rasping through plank made the hair on his arm lift. He found himself counting the strokes because numbers give shape to hours otherwise unrecognizable. Evelyn hummed, not to drown the noise but to weave her quiet through it. Alysos's eyes opened in the hum and found the bars, and then beyond them the man who had sent a horse into a dark it didn't deserve. She said his name, the right way, and though his ear did not know it, his bones did. Evelyn hushed her without punishment and held a cup to her lips. Alysos drank like a woman who had invented the trick of small sips. Then she licked her lips and let a smile find only the left corner of her mouth, and that corner lifted to show there was a sense of humor still occupying the house where fever had taken its rooms. She watched Jesse with that steady look the sick sometimes have when they are awake between waves. She made a tiny motion of her hand, a drawing down gesture like a person binds hair before work. Evelyn understood in the way women understand questions asked without sound, and she moved close to the bars so voices could travel without tricking the jailer. Jesse leaned his forearms on the horizontal and let his tied hands rest there. Alysos's voice came out rasped by heat and travel and the brittle hours of the day, but it carried across. There was enough Spanish to meet his, enough gestures to carry what it couldn't, and the common tongue turns out to be grief when the subject is children. "Two," she said, and held up 2 fingers. "Un niño una niña. She made the small curve of a baby's jaw in the air, then sized the other by holding her palm flat at the height of the cotrail. Tomados al norte, por hombres sin casa, hombres con olor del barril. She wrinkled her nose. Llevan niños como sacos en mula. Cruzan en rutas de ustedes. She let the possessive sit there without blame. They hide in your tracks, she added in a limp English her mouth remembered from trading. Your roads, your carts, your noise. Por eso vine. She tapped her chest, slow. I came for names. Para el nombre. Without a name. And here she looked at Evelyn. To be sure, the old woman would carry the shape of this into her own strong language later. The world eats a child and says it was always hungry. Con nombre, we can spit it back at the world. Jesse stared at the iron bar until the bar blurred in his vision and became nothing but the notion of a straight line. His mind walked back the road he had walked 2 nights ago, the coil of rope around his waist sawing skin, the horse taking a weight that did not belong to it, the moon making old thorns look like new teeth. He realized the kind of realization that does not arrive as enlightenment, but as a lowering of a weight onto an empty place. That his hat had not been the only thing he set on the ground to make himself less dangerous. His horse had carried not merely a stranger's body, it had carried the last witness who could walk a finger back along the tangled thread to the children before they were swallowed completely by geography and time. He found his hand closing into itself as if it could hold on to that thread here, through iron. What else? He asked softly. Tell me what I need to believe, if I'm to say it, so others believe me. She told him about the traders who had no houses because houses make you care about what surrounds them. She told him their jackets smelled of lamp oil and molasses, of saddles worn by too many men. She told him that one had a scar in his scalp you could see when his hair blew, the white string of it running like a lazy river toward his ear. She told him a name, Raphael, on the lips of a boy who had been let down to drink and had called it to himself to be brave. She described a place where the river slowed and made a fat bend around a stand of cottonwoods, where someone had built a crude ladder into the bank with stolen hand-hewn planks from some rancher's fence. Ahi, she said. There. They wait there when they think nobody is watching. 3 nights passed, then north. She closed her eyes as if to trap the image on the inside of their lids where nobody could smudge it. Evelyn took these facts and put them in her pocket where God keeps such things safe until they can be used. She says they use McCrae's road, Evelyn translated for the space between Alisos's tongue and Jesse's ear, because it's safe for cowards. Men who sell children do not drive through places that make them answer questions. The paper McCrae had offered returned to Jesse's mind like a fish chasing along behind a lure and then seeing the hook. He saw that the offer had a different kind of sharpness hidden in it. Water rights were less about law and more about roots, and roots were the bones of a body the Baron wished to own from skull to heel. He looked down at his wrists, rope stitches rough. He could, in a very narrow universe built only of himself and immediate salvation, sign and walk away breathing. But the paper would buy men who steal children a well-lit road and a soft word at the office door. He could smell the ink already approving their passage. Footsteps sounded on the boardwalk outside the jail with a heel-first authority, followed by the little hiss men make when they have just lit cheroots, because gallows make them need to turn fire into smoke. McCrae returned. Not because he needed anything from Jesse this minute, he had the paper ready to be signed at dawn, if fear softened a neck, but because men like him like to check their work. He regarded Evelyn through the bars with the faint fondness one feels for a stubborn hen who persists in setting a clutch through snake season. Mrs. Carter, he said, as if greeting her outside church on a Sunday he had paid for, I am sorry for the discomfort this has brought you. The committee will see that costs are accounted for. Evelyn did not lift her face. You can't write off a bruise, she said, and you can't balance what you took on a ledger. McCrae turned to Jesse and tucked his thumbs in his belt because he could not keep his hands from wanting to rest on ownership. Consider, he said, sleep on it. Dawn is named for decisions. He didn't wait for an answer because he had already written the rest of his night, and it did not include hearing a no. Tom Avery appeared in his place when McCrae had gone, and the boy at the jail desk tried to look busy so he would not have to participate in this quiet. Avery's shirt was spattered with someone else's blood, probably the doctor's, and sweat had made a road down the side of his face. Without the badge, his voice felt looser in the air, less fenced by obligation. "I can't get you out," he said, before Jesse could ask him to do anything at all. "Not without turning this town into a funeral. I have one thing left that belongs to me, and that is asking. I can go ask for a thing at dawn. I can ask for you to speak before anything else happens. Men sometimes feel as if a speech has already happened when a rope is near, but I can insist. I will insist." Jesse closed his eyes a moment and saw the ridge with the 4 quiet backs on it, then the wider flats with the 70 who had sat all day and not needed to shift to prove their patience. "Do that," he said. "Ask for the kind of quiet at dawn that makes words carry straight." He opened his eyes and found Evelyn looking at him with an attention that might have been maternal if it had not also been so professional. "And if," he began, and then he let the "if" die, because there is a limit to how much anticipation a simple heart can stomach in 1 hour. The jail roof was tin and did not mind who walked on it. A footstep went over their heads as easy as a thought, and then another, lighter, one that remembered how to be felt by beams alone. The boy at the desk looked up at the sound, puzzled and not yet alarmed. A minute later, the small square where a flue had once been rose, carefully out of its socket as if air itself had grown fingers. A dark head appeared in the hole, then a body slender enough to come down without complaint from the bars. Miguel hung for an instant, knees bent, then dropped, a cat refusing to apologize for being in exactly the wrong place. The boy at the desk startled and reached for the rifle at the wall. Miguel's hand found the boy's wrist and folded it down, not violently, but with the authority of an older cousin. "Shh," he said in Spanish, and then remembered to say it in the boy's own tongue. "Quiet, hermano." He met the boy's eyes long enough to hand him back his fear in a calmer form than it had been given to him tonight. Miguel slid a knife out of somewhere that had not looked large enough to hide one. He stood between the 2 cells, blade low, and reversed along his arm. He looked at Jesse, and relief bit across his face before discipline folded it away. "We can go," he said. "I can take your rope off like it was never tied. The roof is soft, like bread. No noise. 3 minutes, and then we are below the alley where trash smells like safety. I tell Hastin, and he opens the ground and eats the men who made it a bad ground." Jesse felt the incredible pull of that small, simple future. He tasted it in his mouth the way a man tastes a name he has been longing to speak. Then he looked across at Alisos, at Evelyn's hands, at the doctor outside leaning against the door jamb with his head bowed because he had not been given the luxury of bleeding sitting down. He thought of the lances and how Earth remembers promises stuck into it. He thought of the gallows going up in honest lumber and dishonest need. He thought of McCrae's paper and the way it would turn the theft of water into a hymn for merchants if someone did not stand and say, in public and in words that would be remembered, no. He shook his head, and the refusal cost him more than a wound. "If I leave this way," he said, "the town learns the wrong story. They learn that peace is only held by a knife and a roof. They learn that a promise is good until it hurts, and then it can be cut free like a blister." He took a breath and made a shape big enough in himself to hold the rest. "Carry this instead. At dawn, in the street, in front of both doors, you ask Hastin to bring himself and the elders and stand where all eyes can see them. Avery will stand there too. Before any rope touches a beam, I will speak words where they cannot be stolen by a hallway. I will say what you told me. I will say where the children were taken, and by whom, and by which road, and which goods, molasses, lamp oil, will point a finger at the men who used your tracks to hide their stink. I will make McCrae listen to himself out loud with the paper in his pocket. He will show more than he means to when a town is the wall his words bounce off of." Miguel looked as if he had swallowed a handful of nails and discovered they were made of sugar. The plan was too clever and too foolish to dismiss. His thumb worried the knife's hilt the way a boy worries a worry stone. "He will kill you while you talk," he said, plain. "Maybe," Jesse said, "but a talking rope is hard to look at. Men are vain. They like their justice neat. You put a crowd and a story between a man and his mess, and he hesitates just enough for another man to find his page." He looked toward the door where the boy jailer pretended to snore. "Bring Hastian. Bring the elders. Make the circle close enough that fear has to do its work later in the day. Miguel, I need your words to fit in the space between my ones so nothing falls. Can you do that?" The young man touched his chest and nodded like a boy asked by his grandfather to carry an ember and keep it alive through a crossing. "I can," he said. He looked at Alisos and bowed his head with a tenderness so sudden and so fierce that even Evelyn exhaled her courage a notch and let love have a seat. He slipped the knife through the bars into Jesse's tied hands and then took it back when Jesse did not take it. "No?" he asked, as if asking please would make a different answer. "No," Jesse said. "I'll need the rope in the morning for a trick." The joke was too brittle to carry humor, but it held something else, defiance's small flame in a room designed to put breath out. Miguel smiled despite his dread and pushed the flue cap back into place and went up into the tin darkness like a word, returning to its proper mouth. Avery breathed out. "You're a fool," he said, but the sentence coddled a respect that did not dare show itself fully in case it scared the plan away. "I'll get the day you asked for. I don't know what else I can pry from men who are already busy pretending to be brave." "Bring the doctor," Jesse said, and the doctor lifted his head, astonished and offended. "I mean to say your name in the street with truth attached to it. If we're going to try to thread a needle with a hurricane around our hands, I'll want the thread to be you. If he has papers, deliveries, freight, anything that makes a shape, bring one. Men love paper. Paper makes them feel as if they never wrestled a pig." Nathaniel smiled with half his mouth because the other half had swollen shut enough to make speaking a little indecent. "I have a page in my vest," he said, and he sounded almost smug because an old man knows his pockets better than anyone questions. "He dropped it in my house. His man picked up the rest. He left this one. Grease stain, molasses, date that lands exactly where her words do." He reached into his inner pocket and palmed a rectangle of folded paper with the secrecy of a boy hiding a bird's egg. He did not hand it through the bars. "In the morning," he said, "else they'll pry the world out of my hand while I'm sleeping." The page went back to live above his heart until dawn. The hammering staggered and then stopped. Distant boots scuffed plank while men admired their carpentry, and someone spoke through the night with a satisfied drawl that suggested a job to be proud of. The sky had turned the color of cooled ashes, gray that still remembered being red, unwilling yet to admit it was only dust. The town lay underneath it in pieces, a woman at a window with her hand on the pane where she had pressed it too long, a dog under a wagon twitching in a dream that chased rabbits that had not been, a boy outside the jail door, truly asleep now, head tilted, mouth open to catch his own sadness before it fell. Jesse lay on the narrow bench with his hands on his chest, rope loose enough now that he could slide his fingers a fraction under it. He felt bruises beginning to name themselves with nested aches. He listened to Evelyn breathe in Alisos's cell and to Alisos breathe under Evelyn's hand. He found in that twin rhythm a metronome to set his morning words to, the part of him that had always preferred to stand slightly aside from the center of a room, the part that protected him from being too much to anyone, moved closer to the spine of things and sat down. Fear visited like a quiet thief, trying the latches of his carefulness, testing the windows of his composure. He let it in and let it sit. He did not offer it coffee. It would leave when it realized there was nothing in him worth stealing that he wasn't willing to spend. Out in the yard, someone flicked the rope and laughed to hear it sing. He wondered if the man would laugh the same way in 3 hours when words had touched the rope and changed its sound. He did not pray. He did not know how to do that without insulting the God he had ignored, except as a swear when pain insisted. He spoke instead to the earth that had taken lances into itself earlier, told it he was counting on its memory being as good as Miguel's. Hold for me, he thought, the way you held for them. Hold 1 more hour, and then I'll put the rest back where promises live. Dawn arrived without ceremony, the kind of pale light that has learned not to brag after nights like this. It ran a thin blade along the gallows edge until the crude carpentry gleamed as if proud of itself. The yard in front of the jail filled like a creek bed after a sudden storm. Stones first, then drift, then the heavy, immovable things that decide where the water will go. Men came with faces that had practiced hardness, and women came with faces that had practiced not showing what they feared. The bell did not ring. It watched. Out on the flats, the warriors returned as if they had never left, as if the night had simply folded around them and opened now to reveal the same shape. 70 became countable not by faces, but by the way space organized itself between them. They did not shout. They did not make a noise at all beyond leather's hush and the soft question of horse breath in the cool. They formed a corridor from the far edge of town to the gallows, a passage with its own gravity. People who strayed into it by accident felt themselves guided out again by nothing more than the stillness of animals trained not to break. Hastian rode forward with the 2 elders like punctuation at the end of the sentence he had written yesterday with 7 lances. He planted 8 more into the earth, 1 by 1, even-spaced, the sound of each butt hitting dirt like a small drumbeat you could march a heart to. He made his pledge wider and deeper in the only language earth cannot mishear. Warriors stepped down and stood behind the spears with their hands at rest, palms open, as if to say, this is a fence that does not bite. It is a line that keeps violence from pretending to be law. Sheriff Avery came bare of badge, but not of authority. He had wrung a concession from the men who had slept little and dreamt of ropes. The speaking would come first. He took his place to the side of the platform, where the gallows cut the sky into an ugly frame. Evelyn stood beneath it, with a basin on her hip, because she would not let the mourning be arranged by men alone. Nathaniel Carter had his hat pulled low and his mouth set in a straight line that tried to be gentler than his blackened eye would permit. He carried something inside his vest, like a man carrying fire in a paper sack and hoping the wind stayed friendly 1 more minute. McCrae stepped onto the gallows with the reluctance of a man climbing a stage he believes beneath him, and also exactly his size. He had calculated the angle of the morning to make his face look like reason, not hunger. He had chosen a necktie the color of smoke, so guilt would feel at home near it. He surveyed the corridor of warriors and the corridor of townsfolk inside it and decided that this theater could be rented for his story as easily as any other. Let the man speak, he said with graciousness he had measured in advance. A town that listens is a town that will live. They brought Jesse out between 2 new deputies who had learned their swagger from the older men overnight and wore it uncomfortably like borrowed boots. His hands were still tied in front, and the rope burn along his waist had darkened into an ugly belt that no tailor would claim. He took the steps as if he were climbing into a hayloft with a pitchfork waiting, not to threaten, but to work. There were faces he knew, and faces he had never looked at for more than a second from a saddle. And this morning they all looked like mirrors, a little too honest to admire yourself in. If you speak, McCrae murmured near his shoulder, voice oiled, say short things. Men like short. They don't like to be kept from their certainty. Jesse looked to the ridge, where the line of horses had become a wall of listening. He saw Miguel standing at the corridor's mouth with his chin up and his shoulders squared, as if they could carry the weight of 2 languages without stooping. I'll need him, Jesse said, nodding toward the young scout. Words bend in this town. I want them straight. McCrae hesitated a fraction because he understood the danger of clarity and then waved a hand in a gesture meant to look magnanimous. Miguel came like a thread drawn through a needle's eye, exactly the right speed. Jesse began without clearing his throat. The voice he found was the one he had used last night, telling fear to sit down and wait its turn. "You built a gallows," he said, and something in the crowd tightened, happy to be named. "Before you hang a man on it, you should check that the truth you're tying to his neck isn't yours." He lifted his tied hands to point with his whole arm because he had no free finger. A line cabin burned in the night. It burned like it had been arranged for burning. Kindling stacked, chair legs broken, paint splashed where paint doesn't belong, feathers left like crumbs on a table. You know as well as I do that men who have ridden into your yards for years don't leave their names at the door unless they mean you to go looking for the wrong man. Miguel gave the words his mouth could carry, and then gave them the leader's tongue, and it changed nothing essential in them. Truth can go barefoot across languages if it has to. "Near the creek," Jesse went on, 2 miles north of that bend where the cottonwoods make a question mark in the sky, there's canvas laid over crates that don't hold grain. There are fence posts red at the ends where a saw kissed yesterday, and wire like a long, mean promise, ready to bite anything that drinks. There's dynamite enough to turn rock into compliance. There are footprints that stand like men about to be paid." A murmur went through the yard, like wind shaking a dry field. Men looked at each other in that specific way neighbors do when they realize they might have been paying to be fooled. "And while we were all busy arguing about what a town owes itself," Jesse said, 2 small children were carried along our roads like sacks, a boy and a girl. One with a jaw like this," he cupped the air low, "and one tall enough to stand at a cot rail and look over. Men took them who smell of lamp oil and molasses because they use the same supply the mill uses, the same road the Baron built because roads make him richer. Those men hid their tracks under tracks that look like the ones you fear. They used your fear to move their cargo past your doors while you slept. They'll sell the children again if we let a wrong hanging make us feel clean." He did not raise his voice. He lifted the words just enough to carry to the back without the help of the bell. Miguel made them fit, Spanish to English to the leader's language and back, the same bones dressed in coats that fit the hearer's ear. Nathaniel Carter stepped forward then because he knew timing like he knew breath. He took the folded page from inside his vest and held it like a communion wafer, not offered to just anyone. "He dropped this in my house when he came to admire his work," the doctor said. "It's a ledger page for deliveries. Molasses, lamp oil, sacks of flour, nails, dated last and this week. The route matches exactly what she—" He nodded toward Alisos's absence as if her presence were here as hallowed as any. "Told us between fevers. It is a route that avoids eyes. It is a route no one takes except people with business they would rather argue for after they've been paid." He handed the page not to McCrae, but to Sheriff Avery, who had contrived for this moment to matter more than the badge in his pocket. Avery read, without hurry. He touched the grease stain that smelled like sugar gone wrong. He traced his thumb along the line, where the route turned toward the cottonwoods, then up. "Wade," he called without looking up. "You see this? You know this hand. You've taken goods off these wagons." Wade Cutter's face performed surprise with the skill of a man who has practiced denial as if it were dance. "I load what the boss pays for," he said too fast. "I don't drag kids." Jesse took the rope of the morning and pulled hard once on sense. "He's not saying you dragged them," he said. "He's saying you made the roads safe for men who did. You gave them a gate and a watchman who looked the other way because he liked his wages smooth." McCrae's smile had been rehearsed to hold in many winds. It held now, but its edges showed strain, a little fraying where the corners meant to turn down into benevolence and instead wanted to bare teeth. "We are a town," he said louder. "We do not hang men at the end of sermons given by—" He gestured, letting Jesse and Miguel and the Lances and Avery all share the insult. Confused sympathizers. Enough. He lifted his hand, as he had lifted it last night in the church, when he discovered the town would like to move at his pace. Take the page. Before someone could ask by what right, he said it plain in a sentence only men already inclined to obey would have heard as proper. "Seize that evidence, disperse this crowd. If someone refuses, fire into the air and then lower." This is the place where, in the old stories, things come apart. The hired men surged like a wave that has been waiting too long for an excuse. They shot a brace of warning into the sky because their boss liked the sound of control. The crowd ducked and broke and scattered the way quail do when boys who have not been taught gentleness rush the brush. A woman stumbled. An old man fell with an oath that made his grandchildren proud, even as they flinched at the crack of gunfire. The deputies reached for the page in Avery's hand with the entitlement of men who have never had to consider the price of their reach. The warriors did not charge. They did not become the story the town had purchased tickets for. They moved like water, finding the low place around furniture in a flooded room. They wheeled by twos and threes, not toward the men with guns, but toward the people who had come to watch and who now needed shepherding. A line of riders slid in between hired guns and the nearest cluster of mothers with their skirts grabbed up. And then those riders dismounted in one fluid motion and turned their horses sideways to become walls. Blades came out, but not in the way men in this town were used to seeing them. The flats, not the edges, met rifles at wrists with a ringing that sounded almost polite. Men discovered the humiliating firmness of being disarmed without being cut. Veer stuttered, surprised by mercy it could not name. Miguel found Jesse's shoulder in the shuffle and shoved him toward the stallion, and Jesse shoved him back the other way. Stay with the women, with Evelyn. Guard the healing. The young man hesitated exactly as long as it takes to confirm what he had already decided. He went with Evelyn and two of the older warrior women toward the jail where Alisos had been kept, because safety for one person may require a theft, and some thefts are plainly holy. They used a door that had always existed and that men had simply never noticed because they liked their doors dramatic. Within breaths, Alisos was on a travois lashed to a spare pony, her splint braced with blankets. She was half awake and angry enough at the day to do her breathing with a determination that would have shamed a drunk into sobriety. They swung wide of the yard, toward the cottonwoods, where shade could be turned into a kind of shelter if you worked quick and believed in the competence of women. In the yard, Avery stepped into the path of Wade Cutter's reaching hand and turned it at the wrist, the way an old horseman turns a fresh colt, just enough to teach it manners. "No," he said, and the small word struck the air like a nail, head flush. "You'll get this paper when a man in a robe who isn't bought says you may." Wade snarled and brought his other fist up, but some enforcement never leaves a man's bones even without a badge pinned to skin. Avery dropped him with a short, boring punch that would not impress anyone at a bar, and yet made Wade sit on the ground, blinking like a person surprised to be in a place lower than he believed possible. Rook rushed from the side with his usual 90-degree ferocity. Two of Avery's loyal men, farmers most days, deputies only when decency required a costume, stepped in and had Rook face down on planks fast enough to disappoint his own sense of himself. "Wade Cutter," Avery said, breathing hard but steady, "you're under arrest for arson at the North Line cabin and for a whole mess of pretending the law is a hat you get to wear when it matches your vest." The words marched, practical as fence posts. He nodded to the men at his shoulders. String him to the rail and let him hear the talking he meant for someone else. Wade tried to make a scene, but found that scenes require an audience that believes your heroism. The town had turned its head. McCrae saw his center slipping and lunged for it with the reflex of a man who cannot live without being the tallest thing in a room. He snatched at the ledger page. Avery held on. For an instant, two kinds of power tugged at a flimsy thing that nevertheless carried weight greater than both. Proof amateur, proof clumsy, proof enough. The paper tore, not along its fold, but in a new line the day had written for it. McCrae didn't even blink. He grabbed the largest piece and bolted from the platform with a speed men assumed soft hands can't manage, and that soft hands like his practice in secret. He slipped through the confused edge of the crowd. Confused, yes, but not panicked thanks to those horses set sideways, and found the lane that led to the creek as if he had always meant to go there at a run. Jesse moved on the feeling that his life had narrowed down to the width of that paper. He took the stallion without asking, and the horse accepted him without asking questions. Hastien was already in motion. He needed no signal not to delegate what pride would have liked to keep at a distance. They rode side by side in a rhythm that would have made Miguel smile if he'd seen it. Two heartbeats falling into a run together. The lane took them between fences Jesse had mended without pay because he hated to watch good rails rot. It took them past the mill house where water had once sung about grain and now mumbled to itself about contracts. It took them to the ribbon of creek where cottonwoods held up the new day, like women holding a quilt, to see whether the light had caught the color right. McCrae reached the water and turned, chest heaving, not because he hadn't trained for this, but because he had trained for it alone. Men who ride with no one behind them do not learn to spend their breath wisely. He pulled the pistol he kept for show, a city gun polished to a softness that had never had to be used to kill anything living. Then he used it anyway, because necessity is a story greedy men love to hear themselves tell. He fired at Jesse because it would have satisfied him to see a man who declined a bargain pay for it in public, where terror could learn from example. Hastien moved the way a man moves when he has lived a long time with the understanding that his body is a thing he can give on purpose. He put himself between metal and the target without thinking of words like courage, which is how courage likes to be done. The bullet took him high and left, in that dirty meat between shoulder and chest where pain has room. He stumbled because bodies insist on registering such things, and then he did not permit himself another step backward. He threw himself forward into McCrae with a tackle that had nothing elegant in it, and that therefore could not be anticipated by a man who had governed his life through grace. They went down together in water that did not care about their names, water that did its best right then to wash both men clean of the morning. Jesse was off the stallion without remembering how he had dismounted. He waded into the shallows and hit McCrae's wrist hard enough to convince his fingers they no longer wished to curl around the gun. The pistol jerked out of the man's hand, skipped once off a stone, and sank into a foot of water, where it discovered it was less modern than it had believed. Hastien's mouth was open, not with a cry, but with the kind of effort breathing needs to make when something has taken up sudden residence where it should not. He held McCrae's collar with both hands as if he meant to keep him from drowning, for no other reason than that a drowning sours judgment and steals it from courts. He dragged the Baron, who had never truly worked a day of labor with his hands, into mud that did not recognize a title. Avery and 3 of his men appeared on the bank with the anxiety of people who know they are late and that lateness will live in them longer than they wish. A dozen townspeople had followed at a brave distance, curiosity pulling them where decency had warned them away. The warriors did not swarm. 2 had come because 2 was what one oath allowed. They took up positions without threatening anyone but chance itself. The elders had not come because elders know that too much truth in one place can make a fire. They kept the yard from becoming a stampede instead. Jesse leaned on McCrae's back with knee and weight and plain disgust. "No more," he said, and the words came out flawed around breath. "No more hiding your thirsty in other men's mouths." He took the sodden half-page from the water, where it clung to a stone like a drowned moth, and smoothed it on his thigh. The ink had run only a little. The stain of molasses bloomed like a bruise. The rote line survived where it needed to. He lifted it in 2 fingers for Avery to see, for the men behind to see, for the creek to see, so that it could testify if men forgot. McCrae spat mud and argument. "You don't know the cost," he said, hoarse and small now that water had taken dignity's starch out of his voice. "You don't know what drought does to cattle, to mills. You'd make saints of men who would trade your scalp for a nail if you asked them gently." "No," Jesse said, and realized that he believed the simplicity of that, the way a child believes a story, if it has the right ending. "I make saints of no one. I make men answer for what they put their names on." He shifted his weight and looked to Hastien, because that is where his body wanted to look whenever it needed to be told whether it was doing a thing that matched honor. The war leader had gone very still in that way living men do when the mind has not decided yet where to put its continuation. Blood ran in a clever line down his side to avoid wasting itself. He had propped himself against a root that the creek had patiently, over years, shaped to accept a back. He watched the men on the bank the way a hawk watches rabbits, not for sport, for truth. He read them. He read Avery, who was already binding his duty to this swollen morning. He read the townsmen who were busy deciding whether they would carry the day's weight to supper or set it down for women to wash around. He read Jesse, whose mouth was set in that straight, tired line that means a man is about to keep paying and paying for a choice that felt simple when he made it. Behind them, hooves and the small, careful noises of people's breath announced a different kind of arrival. Miguel appeared at the cottonwood's edge with Evelyn and the two older women. Between them on a travois was Alisos. They had moved her because staying in the jail while wood swung in the yard had felt like an insult to the promise they had made the earth. She slid from the travois with a grace taught by pain and by women who do not let men decide where a body may lie. She went to her knees in the shallows as if the water had called her by her childhood name. She pressed both palms into the creek as if to take its cool up into her bones, and then crawled the last short distance to Hastings' side. She said his mother's name, not his, because sometimes calling a man back requires the oldest rope. She set her hand to his face above the place where the bullet had argued with muscle, and she did not cry because weeping steals hands from their work. She took the strip of cloth Evelyn offered without looking and pressed it against the wound with that practical pressure that keeps men alive. Hastings' eyes found hers and softened in a measure Jesse could feel down in his own sternum. The hard morning shrank around them until it was only a room with 3 quiet people in it. A leader who had stepped between greed and another man's life. A woman whose life had been stepped across and who would not let it be again. And a stubborn fool who had given up his horse and discovered that kindness can turn out to be a long road you never finish, even if you start running. Avery hauled McCrae to his feet and shoved him toward his men with care, but no courtesy. "You're under arrest," he said, "for the arson you paid for the theft you arranged and called necessary, for the death you tried this morning to make into a lecture." McCrae opened his mouth to argue that none of those words were properly legal. The doctor lifted the soggy half of the page like a sacrament, and the argument collapsed under the weight of paper, as paper sometimes makes men do, ridiculous and real. Jesse put one hand to Hastian's shoulder carefully and said to no one and everyone, "We have the page and the man. That's enough for the next piece." He kept his voice even, because panic wastes blood. Around them, the crowd's noise swelled and ebbed in a tide, learning its new shore. In the cottonwood's shade, the stallion shook his mane as if to fling water from it, and the motion had the feel of a benediction. The sun cleared the ridge and laid a gold stripe across the water like a path a person could walk if he had another day to give to it. Men who had come to see a hanging watched a different spectacle and were not yet ready to admit they preferred it. Warriors who had come to stand between an execution and a bloodbath stood between the wounded and the curious with the same competence. The gallows waited behind them in a yard that would not need it this hour. The creek ran exactly as it had yesterday, exactly as it would tomorrow, provided men remembered not to call theft a strategy. They set McCrae in the mud because mud does not mind being the thing that holds a man who has loved only dry ledgers. They saved the ledger and handed the wet half to Avery and the dry half to the doctor. They pressed linen to Hastings' wound and tied a knot that would hold until a better hand could take it in. Alisos leaned into her kin with her head set so that her cheekbone pressed just there, exactly where memory lives under the skin. The morning's hard edges blunted, not to softness, but to a shape a human could touch without cutting himself. And the narrator, who had distrusted days like this for most of his life, found himself wanting, beyond reason, for the man under the cottonwood to keep breathing, so Jesse Hale would not have to learn the shape grief makes when it sits beside pride. The courthouse smelled of beeswax and old paper, the kind of dignified scent that tries to remind men they are capable of fairness. It was a room built for small disputes, fence lines, straying hogs, debts remembered wrongly, but this morning it had to hold the weight of a town's self-respect. People came early, not because they loved justice, but because they were not yet finished with their astonishment at having survived the day that should have ended differently. They filled benches and windows and stood along the walls in their shirt sleeves, hats clasped to chests or twisted at the brim like confessions, and they made a silence that was louder than the church's best hymns. You could feel the quiet climb up the judge's bench and sit there, legs dangling like a boy's, eager to watch. Silas McRae sat where the accused sit when they have never believed the word could belong to them. The mud from the creek had dried on his trousers to a grey crust. It flaked when he shifted and went to live in the cracks of the floor. A starched collar tried to restore dignity to his neck and failed. His hair lay neatly in its usual line, not because he had combed it there himself, but because a habit of being tended to often persists even after the body that required tending has been found wanting. He looked around the room and recognized men he had bought by the day and the job and the drink. He recognized a few he had bought by their own fear disguised as prudence. They did not look at him the way purchased things usually look at the buyer. Their eyes had found new work. Sheriff Tom Avery, badge back where it belonged, stood to the side of the bar with a steadiness that had returned to him with the metal. The town had come near to calling him ornamental. Now it remembered why men had once measured their own decency by how long they could stand under his plain gaze. He had Wade Cutter by the elbow and Rook with both wrists bound, not roughly, but without affection. The foreman, Cutter, who had liked the way violence fit his hand too much, looked smaller with rope around his wrists, as men always do when they meet limits they thought were only rumor. He stared right past McRae, which is a way of showing loyalty that fools itself into being bravery. Rook looked at his boots as if only they had stayed true to him. The bailiff called for quiet the way men call for rain, twice and with skepticism. Then the territorial judge, lean, grey, eyelids made for looking unimpressed, took his seat and rubbed the bridge of his nose as if headaches were a species protected by law in such rooms. He nodded once at Avery, once at the town, once at the world in general, which seemed to satisfy his duty to politeness. "We will have only what can be carried on a page," he said. "If it floats on gossip, it drowns here." The doctor's bruises had come into their colors overnight. Plum, saffron, the black that looks blue if you love a man and want to see sky where there is none. Nathaniel Carter stepped up with a carefulness the room recognized as authority in a different coat. He did not begin with speeches. He unfurled the ledger page and its damp twin as a baker sets two cakes side by side to cool. He set a finger to the first, to the line of deliveries: molasses, lamp oil, sacks of flour, nails, and the dates. He set a finger to the second, to the smear where water had tried to erase what guilt could not. "These are the roads of a man's hunger," he said. "If you follow them, you will find not only fences where spring water has always belonged to the thirsty, but also a place where men who sell children can walk without stumbling over inconvenient questions." He lifted his eyes and let the bruise at his temple keep his language honest. "This page dropped from Mr. McRae's hand in my house. I do not say he burned the line cabin himself. I say he put the men and the story in place, then used both to turn a town against its own promise." D. Miguel stood behind him in a blue shirt, borrowed from a man who had never imagined his sleeves would help carry this kind of work. The judge raised an eyebrow, unsure whether youth and foreignness ought to speak. Avery spoke first. "He will interpret when needed," he said. "Else you'll try this case twice in 2 languages and wear out what patience we've got." Alisos could not climb the steps. She sat at the end of the first bench, with Evelyn's arm braced behind her back and her eyes as clear as water after flood. When asked what she had seen, she said names like landmarks and dates the way women name the day a child lost its first tooth, casually, accurately. She described the way station downriver, the cottonwoods planted like a question beside the bend, the crude ladder runged with stolen fence planks. She said Raphael as if it were a thorn she had been permitted to lay on a table at last. She said lamp oil and molasses, and pointed with 2 fingers, the doctor's page and Jesse's words yesterday, stitching together without a seam where a dishonest man could try to tug them apart. Miguel carried each word to ears that had learned to hear him with respect. The judge wrote like someone who had long ago accepted that ink is heavier than it looks. Avery put Wade on the stand next, and Wade tried to use bluster the way a man tries his favorite saddle on a lame horse. Stubborn, foolish, nostalgic. The sheriff asked him to name the hour he left town the night before the cabin burned. Wade tried 3 different hours on and found none fit. The sheriff asked him to explain why canvas at the creek covered crates marked with dynamite, why fresh fence posts lay red-mouthed by the water, why wire waited like a clenched jaw in the shade. Wade's mouth performed names and numbers and came up with wind. Rook did worse. The world had never prepared him for inquiry in tones that did not offer him an exit. His words became furniture he tripped over. McCrae kept his voice small because Large had betrayed him. He spoke of necessity, of drought, of the arithmetic that claims some men must suffer so that numbers may add up for the rest. He praised fences the way a certain kind of preacher praises hell, as a favor. And then he slipped because men who admire their own logic forget the places where it cracks. I did what the season demanded, he said. I made routes efficient so supplies flowed. I ensured negotiated calm by taking leverage out of play. By kidnapping a patient out of a sickbed, Avery said mildly. By moving an individual from a site of volatility to one designed for order, McCrae corrected, and half the room winced because the euphemism was uglier than the act. The judge looked up from his notes, his eyelid twitching once with the effort required not to let amusement spoil the record. And the cabin, he said, just to hear the sound a lie makes when it lands on the tongue of a man who believes his money has made him fluent. Savages, McCrae said too quickly. They left their sign, the judge supplied, a hair-tired, paint and porcupine and tracks that looked copied out of a dime novel. Sheriff, bring me the boots you took from Mr. Gutter and the burlap we pulled off his heels. Avery did, because the jail was 100 feet and a lifetime away, and he had taken the liberty of using the time between dawn and now to collect what a judge might want to hold. The burlap smelled of kerosene and sage, fake enough to embarrass a mule. The boot's tread matched the pattern that had been so obligingly left in the ash at the line cabin. The town made a sound like a chair gently pushed back from a table. The human body's version of I knew it, and also I didn't want to know it. The judge delivered his conclusion, the way a carpenter sets the final nail. Sure, satisfied, reluctant to waste more strokes. Silas McCrae, this court finds that you orchestrated the arson at the North Line cabin through agents, that you suborned the authority of this town to seize an injured woman as leverage, that you materially supported the movement of illicit cargo, namely 2 children, across this jurisdiction by providing cover and routes, and that you intended to fence a watercourse whose title you do not hold. He looked up, as if he had misplaced his spectacles, and in the looking found the word everyone had been waiting for. Guilty, he said simply. As to the creek, the claim dissolves. As to the rest, you will sit in the territorial jail while we collect more paper. I have little doubt a proper judge with a cleaner carpet than mine will call this what it is, which is crime, and send you where men who commit it go. Some men breathed out, some women did. A few men discovered that breath had been sneaking in and out of them without their permission the whole time. The door banged in on a gust. Sunlight cut a slice across the floor, like a new rule. The bell rang then, late, as bells often are for justice, and the sound went up over roofs and out over flats and into the ears of horses that raised their heads and found they did not need to run. Avery put his badge back on the lapel properly after court recessed. It looked as if it had been made for that piece of cloth. He walked the creek line with the elders in the afternoon, where the cottonwoods were learning to be symbols whether they liked it or not, and they looked at water as men who had drawn maps of battlefields, eye bridges. Miguel stood between and constructed a language wide enough to hold a future without insulting either past. The town gathered in rings that sometimes turned into knots and sometimes into braids, and no one brought rifles because the lances had done the remembering for them. The treaty came out simple because the people who needed it to work insisted on it. A page from the judge's docket, blank save for a faint watermark, was borrowed and laid against a saddle. On it, in sober lines and without ornament, the town and the elders wrote, "The spring shall not be fenced. Anyone thirsty may drink. The creek will be shared in the dry months by schedule agreed at each season's turn. A corridor for grazing and travel will be left wide as 2 wagons near the cottonwoods, and narrower where the land pinches, with signs in both languages set at the crossings. No one will take wood from the doctor's yard, from the churchyard, or from the elders' campfires. If a dispute rises, the sheriff and an elder will meet with bread in hand before any weapon is lifted." The paper became something more than itself when hands touched it. Not ink and fiber, but a promise the earth could hear if pressed to it. They pressed it to the ground, just briefly, because a superstition becomes holy when shared without argument. Hastian came to that meeting on his own feet. It cost him, and you could see the cost in the way he carried his left side like a wrapped gift he meant not to open in public. He did not ride because a horse makes a small lie out of certain wounds by holding a man upright when he ought to lean. He sat under the cottonwoods with his back against bark and watched Jesse sign the page with a hand that trembled only when it had finished its work. When it came time to set gifts according to custom, Hastin called Jesse forward and hung a small medicine pouch around his neck, deerskin soft from being handled by generations, a button made from a bit of river shell, something within it that moved like a story when you breathed on it. Miguel translated, but the room did not need him. It understood the shape of what was being said. Even so, he carried the words as they deserved to be heard. "He names you younger brother," Miguel said, and the consonants fit his mouth as if he had been waiting for this exact sentence all his life, not by blood, not by debt, but by the keeping of lances when it cut. He says a man who puts his body between a promise and noise earns a place where stories sit down to eat. He says you did not take your feet away when they were asked to stay. You will not forget to come when we call, and we will not forget to stop before the hedge when you ask. Jesse touched the pouch without opening it. He did not want to see what the story looked like, because sometimes looking makes a thing smaller. He said thank you in English, then in the Spanish that had learned to recognize itself on his tongue, and then he put his palm to his own chest and bowed his head toward Hastian in a third language made of gesture that even the cottonwoods seemed to know. The war leader's smile did not move much. It did not need to. The corners of his eyes made a better speech than any man's mouth could. 2 days later, downriver, men with wrists tied behind them muttered into their own collars, while the sheriff counted children. The way station was a sorry geometry of commerce. A lean-to of plank, a yard of trampled dirt, a pole with a rope for hanging meat or lies depending on the day. Raphael tried to spit dignity into the dust and found his mouth dry of it. The girl stood behind Avery, tiny hand in the man's big one, and the boy pressed his face into Elisos's skirt, which did not belong to her, but became hers the moment he did. The townsfolk did not press up to the reunion. They stood back under mesquite and made themselves small on purpose. A few cried without noise, a few crossed themselves because saints are sometimes made by afternoons like this without Rome ever finding out. The mother arrived on a mule that had borrowed speed from the idea of its rider's urgency. She did not dismount so much as become the ground beneath the children. The boy's cry was the kind that starts as sorrow and becomes relief before you can tell the difference. The girl's sound was laughter's cousin that lives in the same house and comes to the door when the other is too tired to stand. The father came after late because he had been momentarily paralyzed by the courage required to believe. He knelt like he had found church in the dirt. He thanked everyone and no one, and put his forehead to Avery's fist, and to Alissos's hand, and to Jesse's boot, and then to the earth because it had carried the children back when men might not have. The sheriff stood so awkwardly under that gratitude that one of his ears turned red and stayed that way an hour. Raphael tried to remember a philosophy that made children columns in a ledger. He failed. He had never had a philosophy. He had had fear and opportunity. The judge would give him a philosophy later and call it a sentence. For now he kept his mouth shut and imagined the taste of molasses sour in his teeth long after it had served him his last wage. The stallion stayed with Jesse because the animal had already decided this version of the world suited him. He was not payment. He was the kind of companion a man earns accidentally by doing one right thing, then another, until the tally looks like a plan. Jesse learned him the way you learn a road, where it thinks, where it stumbles, where it takes joy. He did not ride him to show off. He rode him at dawn, along the creek, when the treaty's words looked like mist lifting, and at dusk along the ridge where the lances had once stood. Boys asked the stallion's name, and Jesse said he hadn't asked yet because some names want to find you first. He let them feed the horse-sliced apples they had not asked permission to take and pretended not to see. Wade Cutter's trial was short and without poetry. He went pale when the doctor's page was held up again because paper and consequence are brothers. He took his sentence to the territorial jail with a sneer that pretended not to be fear and failed. Rook cried the day after and tried to hide it under the blanket. But men hear those sounds, and there is a mercy that sometimes grows in rooms where no one meant to plant it. Nathaniel Carter healed slowly because old men do not bounce. They settle. He took to sitting on his porch steps with his boot off and his pride on, and he let townspeople come to ask the kind of questions they used to bring only to one another. He gave them willow bark or scolding or both. Evelyn baked a pie the day the treaty page was framed and hung at eye level in the courthouse. And when men drifted in to look at it, they left with crust crumbs on their lips and the feeling that decency tastes better than fear if you give it sugar and time. Hastian did not ride the way he had ridden. He said it without sadness, as if acknowledging that a river's bend had always been part of its plan and that no map worth keeping pretends otherwise. He walked more, which allowed certain conversations to last longer than they would have on horseback. Boys who had once been taught to run the other way when they saw his band on the flats found themselves inventing errands that crossed his path. He answered their questions with humor, sharp enough to teach. He sat with Avery once on the porch outside the doctor's, and the two men shared the kind of quiet that is not an absence, but a presence made of mutual regard. The sheriff said nothing about badges. Hastian said nothing about lances. Their silence understood both. Miguel made a road between camps and town that did not exist on any map. He grew lean in the way of young men who realize their bodies are vehicles for something larger than themselves. He took words back and forth like cargo, and he wrapped each with care so it would not break in transit. He listened politely, while old men on both sides told him how to translate better, and then he did it the way he knew kept truth from wobbling. He learned to like coffee and to be suspicious of men who offered it too eagerly because they always wanted his yes to come with it. He collected the stories children told and returned them to mothers with the parts fixed that had been unfair to courage. Jesse mended fences that were not about ownership anymore. He fixed the bit at the Carter hedge where the deputies had split wood, and apology was owed to more than the jam. He set new hinges on the door he and Avery had held and smiled when the sound it made opening was ordinary. He found himself invited to sit on porches where he had once been a suspicion, and he went not hungry for praise, but willing to let other people feel settled by the sight of him growing into an ordinary part of their afternoon. He turned down an offer to wear a star because stars are heavy, and he had learned to love his hands empty, ready to catch rather than punish. He did not move away because the town now had his name woven into its gossip and its gratitude, and he could not undo the stitching without tearing something invaluable. If this story moved you, I'd love for you to press like, subscribe to my channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with a friend who enjoys powerful Western tales. I also invite you to explore the other stories and playlists here on the channel. Start another video right now to keep the campfire burning and the long ride going.